Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Such a pleasure for you to join me. I'm going to start this off by saying something rather bold. I believe that this lecture is the most important lecture that I have ever given and likely will ever give. And the reason for that is because this lecture serves as the foundation, the root, the genesis, if you would, of all of the others. As in, if I could sit someone down and ask them to watch just one thing that I've made from start to finish, I would ask them to watch this. Because if someone understands this, all the other dominoes fall in place. The stars align. Everything else just makes sense. And so, rather than blabber on, I'd rather just like to get into it. This is my Blue Ocean Foundations for the 21st century. I'm going to start off right at the beginning with number 1, Blue Ocean thinking. If you were to ask most people, very simple question, what does the future hold? The expectation that most people have is that most people have a status quo bias, expecting the future to merely improve incrementally what currently exists, right? So what we have today will just get better and better and better and better. That's what most people think. Incremental, small improvements, linear improvements over time. But the reality is, if you actually look at history, history shows that the future almost always consists of a series of sudden and unexpected revolutions, right? So it's incremental improvements, and then one day it just shoots up. And then there's more incremental improvements that built upon that revolution, and then there's another revolution, and it just goes up. This is how most of human history has gone. Linear improvements followed by revolutions, followed by linear improvements. All right? And there's actually a book written all about this. It's called Blue Ocean Strategy. And it was a book that originally came out in 2005, was re-released 10 years later and expanded in an anniversary edition in 2015. And as you can see, I've given this book 5 stars. And for those who don't know, who aren't in the Hexagon Book Club, for me to give a book 5 stars, that's very rare. Only a handful of books have ever been given a 5-star, must-read rating from me. I'm a harsh judge. But this book deserves it. And if most people have probably never heard of this book. If you're a manager, particularly in a high-level corporate environment, this is like your Bible. It's almost guaranteed that you've heard of this book at least some point in time, and you've likely read it. But for most people, you've probably never heard of this book before. But it's a business book, a book particularly about rethinking the way that people view business entirely. Because the way that most people view business is, they imagine business as a predefined market space, right? And that market space can be representative of whatever industry, gaming industry, fashion industry, movie industry, whatever. Right? Take your pick. And inside of that predefined market space, you have numerous different businesses. Some are big, some are small, but they're all competing against each other in this industry, in this market space, usually for the same customers, right? So they're competing for your money. And this is what Blue Ocean Strategy refers to as a red ocean. And the reason it's referred to as a red ocean, that metaphor, is that you've got to imagine this like sharks, right? Sharks biting each other in the water, fighting, blood is being spilled, hopefully metaphorically, right? Businesses are competing, they're all trying to destroy each other, they're all trying to rip each other apart, get them out of existence, right? Outcompete them, make them bankrupt, become, the one, almost like a monopoly business, right? And again, this is how, if you ask most people, what is business? This is what they'll tell you. Predefined market space, businesses competing, competition, right? But what Blue Ocean Strategy suggests is, what if there's a different way to do business, right? What if business doesn't have to be this? What if you can do business in a completely different way? And what Blue Ocean Strategy suggests is, rather than a red ocean, why not do a blue ocean, right? Well, what's a blue ocean? Well, we've already spoken about what a red ocean is. In a red ocean, they compete in a contested market, so there's other businesses in the market. A blue ocean, however, They create uncontested market space. So a business going through a blue ocean strategy, as you can see, they're on their own. There is no competition. They aren't looking at other businesses in the industry and going, "Oh yeah, we're gonna eliminate them." No, they're doing their own thing. They're doing something completely unique to the point where there is no competition. There is no metaphorical blood being spilled. They're on their own. In red oceans, they benchmark the self to competition, right? So businesses will say, let's say it's a phone industry. The phone businesses will say, how fast is our phone compared to the competition's phone? Clothing companies will say, how good is our materials compared to the competition's materials? They benchmark each other based on price, quality, and other things. Blue ocean businesses don't really do that. Blue ocean businesses make the competition irrelevant, because the way that, though they're not competing against other businesses in a traditional way, using the predefined industry rules, the usual benchmarks, they are redefining an industry. They're redefining a market. They're not comparing themselves to the businesses already out there that are similar to their business. They're thinking in a whole different dimension. And lastly, red oceans, they aim for existing customers, right? Like the gaming industry aims for gamers, right? Fashion industry aims for fashionistas, right? Blue oceans aim for a totally fresh customer, because blue oceans, they tend to merge industries together. They tend to create, because they're doing something completely new, right? And so if you're doing something completely new, you can't rely on the traditional target market, let's say, of comparable businesses. You're going for a completely different type of customer. And so red oceans are very much predefined, set in stone. You know where you are. You know what you're doing. Blue oceans are much more experimental. They're out there. They're wild. You're taking a risk. You're taking a gamble. You're entering no man's land. You're discovering, you're surfing on a sea that no one else is on or has bothered to try and do. And blue ocean strategies can be very, very risky because they can fail. But they can also succeed. And when they succeed, they change everything. Right? And in fact, you'll remember earlier when I said, what does the future hold? And I said that, history shows that it's a series of revolutions. Well, it is successful blue ocean strategies that cause such revolutions, right? Those big bumps there, that is a blue ocean strategy that has been successfully achieved, and it has redefined business entirely. It's crushed markets, it's created new ones, it's changed everything. Now, speaking about this in abstract terminology and theoretics, blue ocean, red ocean, it can be quite hard to understand. So let's give some real examples, and then you'll understand exactly what a blue ocean strategy really is. So if you look at the travel industry in the year 1890, quite a long time ago, most people, as you can see, they travelled around on a horse and cart, right? That was just the way that people got around back then. That was, just how it was. And if you would have asked people back then, what improvements would you like to see in the travel industry? They would have told you straight up, faster horses, right? Because that's how people travelled. That was travel back then, horse and carriage. Maybe they wouldn't have just said faster horses. Maybe they would have said more comfortable carriages, less noisy carriages, something like that, right? But they were thinking in that paradigm. Again, incrementalism, right? The incremental improvements. They had a status quo bias. What they wouldn't have asked for is, of course, the car, right? Because the car was a complete and utter... the car was a blue ocean strategy. In a time when horses and carriages were the status quo and the default, the car, which is obviously part of the travel industry, it was a completely new way to do things. It was a complete reinvention. And in fact, to showcase how much people had a status quo bias about the horse and carriage, cars weren't originally called cars. Do you know what they were called? Horseless carriages. Can you imagine? The car was not defined by what it is. It was defined by what it isn't, right? It was comparing itself to the status quo, which should really tell you just how deeply ingrained the thinking was behind the horse and carriage. But here's the crazy thing. Not only was the car unexpected, it was initially resisted by many. It's not like the car just came out and everyone said, oh, screw the horse and carriage then, I'm just going to get a car instead. No. In fact, the press actually called the car the devil's wagon, right? It was the devil's wagon. It was a modern Moloch. Moloch, for those who don't know, being a demon that is known to sacrifice young people, right? It's like an ancient demon, right? Probably implying that it's very unsafe for young people to be around. And in fact, there was a quote by, I believe, a bank manager of the time, a famous quote that said, "The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad," right? Now, of course, it's, to be fair to the people back then, cars, when they originally came out, weren't great because they were initially aimed at rich people. They had too many bells and whistles. They broke down a lot, as new technology often does. It's often unstable. And it wasn't until the Ford Model T, the Model T Ford, which was the first mass-manufactured car, you can see it pictured there, did cars become much more cheaper, much more easy to afford, and most people started to take them more seriously. But that doesn't change the fact that when the car first came out, which was clearly a revolution, most people didn't like it, right? They poo-pooed it. Of course, if you fast forward a century, 100 years later to the year 1990, and the car has taken over the world. You don't really see people going around in a horse and carriage anymore. Well, you do sometimes in England, I've got to say, but it's very rare. In fact, the cars have actually become so dominant in society that not having one is basically like having a disability. If you live in places like a city, for example, or even rurally, a car is now considered an expectancy, just something that everyone has, especially in places like America, where public transport tends to be much more limited. In Europe, it's less the case, but America is very car-centric from what I've heard. And so, that the car is an example of a blue ocean strategy that something that revolutionized the travel industry, was completely different to the offerings of the time, and eventually became the status quo. Another example would be if you look at the computing industry in the year 1999, and I've picked that year because it's right before the millennium. Most people back then had a computer that looked like one of these two. So on the left there you can see a Windows 98 computer, right? That's what most people had. Meanwhile, if your family had some taste, they probably had one of them on the right, the iMac, with its fantastic pastel colours. And if you would have asked people back then, what improvements would you like to see in the computing industry? Again, very predictably, what people would have said is faster computers, right? Oh, we want more megahertz in the processor, bigger hard drives, more memory, blah, 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 right? That's what they would have said. What they wouldn't have asked for, however, is the iPhone, the smartphone. Right, back then, the phones and computers were two different things, and never shall the two meet. The computer was perceived by the majority of people. When you heard the word computer, you heard you thought desktop, or in some cases laptop, but mostly desktop. The idea that you could take that a small little thing that you can hold in your hand could do 99% of pretty much all the things that a big fat tower would do, and you need a big monitor and a keyboard and a mouse. That idea was just considered a fiction by most people in 1999. They would have laughed at you if you would have said, if you would have talked about the smartphone, they would have said, keep dreaming. That's not going to come for another, what is this, Star Trek, right? And upon its announcement, the iPhone was mocked or overlooked by many, even the most dedicated Apple fans. People didn't believe in it when it was first announced. In fact, there's a forum called MacRumors, which is very popular with Apple fanatics. And you can see this is a thread from when Apple announced the first ever iPhone back in 2007. And some of the posts that people have put are very interesting. For example, here is someone asking about whether or not is the touchscreen really a wise input method, because surely the screen would just get smudgy, right? I mean, you don't want to use a touchscreen. I'm not going to read all of these posts because you can pause if you want, but this one's very funny. It's about apparently the iPhone put him to sleep upon its announcement. Boring. And, it's too expensive, $499 for a phone. Who's going to pay that? Steve Jobs would have been better off announcing the Airport Extreme than wasting their time on whatever the hell this is. And where's Where's the announcements on macOS? Come on, Apple, what are you doing with this iPhone fad? I think it's quite funny. And even when people recognised, wow, this could actually be a big deal. This could replace desktops and laptops for a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people, maybe to the point where the average person doesn't even need a desktop or a laptop. People said, I think you're taking it a bit too far. Come on, it's just a little toy. You can't. This is not going to replace the Mac or a Windows computer. Lay off it, right? Meanwhile, of course, you fast forward a decade to 2009. Just 2 years after the iPhone and the smartphone revolution generally kicked off, and they're all over the place, right? Ever since 2007, basically, there's been a rampant increase in smartphones every year. Look at this picture here, for example. Good Lord. And again, kind of like the car, to the point where the smartphone has almost become an extension of the body. And without it, you're basically like a disabled person, as I spoke about when I spoke about not using the internet for 6 months. That was one of the main things that I learned. If you don't have a smartphone, it's basically like you're not even human anymore. You can't even operate. You can't even do anything. So it became it's a revolution that became an expectancy, right? And again, if you look at an example more closer to home, search. If you go back in 2020, and you asked people, most people used search engines like Google or DuckDuckGo or Bing, if there's something really wrong with you, to try to find information on the internet. And if you would have asked people back in 2020, what improvements would you like to see in the search industry? Again, people probably would have said faster results, right? Less ads on the search page, more reliable results. What they wouldn't have asked for, however, of course, is a large language model like ChatGPT, where rather than you searching manually on on the search engine, an artificial intelligence can just almost be like your little servant. It trawls the web for you much quicker than you ever could, and gives you all the information that you want in a more human fashion, a more readable fashion. Long gone are the days where you just have to do everything yourself and go through each individual website and accept cookies on every website, thanks European Union. No, now you can just ask away and it'll do all the work for you. But most people wouldn't have asked for that. It wouldn't have even, if you would have told people back in 2020 that something like ChatGPT would exist, again, they would have laughed at you. They would have said, don't be ridiculous, that's too good to be true. And, in fact, following the pattern, ChatGPT was likewise downplayed by many at the time. And my programming friend story proves this well. So I was actually one of the beta testers for OpenAI's artificial intelligence, the DALL-E AI to be specific, which was their image generation. It was standalone back then. Now I think it's been incorporated into ChatGPT, but back then it was a standalone image generator, and I opted in for to be like a beta tester, and I got in. And I made a production on this years ago, which is quite funny to look back at now with all the progress that's been made since. But back then, after DALL-E, ChatGPT came out, I believe in November 2022, and I used it on the first day that it was released to the public. And I was ranting and raving about it because it blew my mind, right? I was like, wow, this is really, this is something else. And I told a friend of mine who's a programmer, hey, have you heard about this ChatGPT thing? And he was like, what is it? And I explained to him what it is, and he was like, it's not that impressive. And I was like, really? It's not that impressive? And he was like, oh yeah, we've had that for years. It was called Cleverbot. And for those who don't know, Cleverbot was like this terrible AI that was out in like 2008 or something, and it was like you would say like, do you like peanuts? And it would say, I like peanut, full stop. And you would be like, whoa, it spoke to me. I'm sure some of you remember this maybe back in the 2000s. And I said, hang on a minute. This is a little bit, comparing ChatGPT to Cleverbot is like comparing an ant to a monster truck. Like this, no, this is something completely revolutionary. Like you're out of your mind. And I was saying like, I think this is going to, really threaten people's jobs potentially in the future, including his. Maybe it'll write code one day. And the guy was just laughing at me like, don't be ridiculous. This is, don't be absurd. Like this is just a little gimmick, nothing to be taken seriously. And a bunch of people responded to ChatGPT's announcement like that back in 22, 23, 24, and even 25. Of course, fast forward half a decade to 2025, and governments around the world, this is the British Parliament, the House of Commons, are constantly discussing the possibilities of artificial intelligence disrupting the economy, particularly for middle-class, white-collar workers, as they're known. Because artificial intelligence might be able to replace them in the not-too-distant future, and that could cause mass redundancies. What do we do when the unemployment rate is 20%, 30%, 40%? Do we have to rebuild the economy, implement universal basic income? What do we do? Right? These questions are now starting to be asked, and they're no longer in the realm of sci-fi, science fiction. They're now being asked seriously as real sociological and economic problems that we're going to face in our lifetime. We're going to face mass unemployment in our lifetime. This has been a revolution. Okay? And so, but you may have noticed in all these three examples, despite being vastly different in terms of time and industry, they follow the same four steps. First of all, you have stagnation, right? You had a stagnating industry, an industry that had predefined rules. It had been like this for years or decades. People had accepted it. People expected the future to be incremental improvements, and then boom, you've got disruption. Something new comes along, replaces the old, and completely redefines the industry. But then, of course, there's initial hesitation. People mock it, people poo-poo it. Well, this is just a fad. It's not a big deal. Blah 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 blah. And then, of course, in the end, you have the revolution. As time passes, people realise actually this is not a fad. This is a real big deal, and it becomes the new status quo. It becomes the new expectancy. And all three of these are examples of a successful blue ocean strategy, overturning a stagnant red ocean. Now, of course, the destiny of all successful blue oceans is to eventually turn red, and thus it begins the cycle anew, right? I mean, today, for example, it's not like the car is still a blue ocean industry. I mean, there's loads of car companies. They all compete against each other, benchmarking against each other. It's not a blue ocean industry anymore. It's a red ocean. It's the new red ocean. Same thing with smartphones. There's loads of smartphone companies, loads of smartphones, and same with large language models. It's not just ChatGPT. You've got loads. Gemini, etc., etc. Right. So, the fate of all successful blue oceans, new revolutions, is to become red oceans eventually. Right. Blue oceans become red oceans. Because competitors see the initial innovation, and they all want to get in on the industry, get in on the money, the potential to be made, right? So hopefully now you understand the difference between blue ocean strategy, between red oceans and blue oceans, and what a blue ocean strategy is. But what's interesting, you might be thinking, well, why am I talking about this? Well, the reason is because while blue ocean strategy is an intentional business philosophy, I actually find it also is an unintentional political philosophy, because while the comparison between red ocean thought and blue ocean thought was originally designed to comprehend the business world, it also works surprisingly well for the political world as well. So if we take a look at, say, the five major political factions, like sort of the five main ideologies that the vast majority of people would align with in some regard, or maybe exclusively, I would say you have, the communists, the socialists, the Marxists, right, the Reds, right, what people would say. Obviously not as much of a big deal today as they were in the past, but still they're around. Then you have the progressives, right, or what people would call the woke, right, sort of like, you know what I'm talking about. When we have the neoliberals, right, economically capitalist, socially progressive. Then we have the libertarians, who are very similar to the neoliberals, but they're much more obsessed with small state, small government, low taxes, freedom, right? And then we have the conservatives, who are a very broad category, right? You've got religious conservatives, Christians, Muslims, monarchists, for the few of them who are still around. Of course, I would include fascists as well in this category, why not? Nationalists in general, right? Conservatism is a very diverse category. These would be the five major political factions. The question is then, are they in red or blue oceans? Right. So if you look at all of these, if they were a business, what would they be in? Well, truth be told, it depends on the time. if we take a look at communism in the 1900s, communism was undeniably revolutionary blue ocean thinking compared to the conservative red ocean status quo. Like if you go back to the 1900s, and I'm talking about the decade, not the century, but the 1900s, the communist way of thought was unbelievably revolutionary. I mean, for example, most countries back then were under a monarchy, right? Well, communism says, no, we don't want kings, we want republics instead. Like, we're not going to have monarchs anymore. No kings, no queens, that's gone out the window. Instead, you're going to have the people. The people who rule the country. Well, that's a revolutionary idea for the time. Same thing with capitalism, right? Most countries were just capitalist. Most people didn't think about it. Yeah, there's money, there's trade, you buy and sell things. I mean, is there any other way to do this? Communism said, hey, how about socialism? How about a centrally planned economy? How about the government does all, decides, who gets what? Create a more equal society. Again, whatever you think about this, it was certainly an original idea for the time in comparison to what everyone else was doing. Same thing with, most countries back then were religious, Christian or Muslim, for example. Communists say, no, we're not going to do any religion anymore. Out with the religion. We're going to focus on science. We're going to be rational. We're going to be logical. None of this Christianity, no religion. We're going to do things in this way from now on. Now, again, that was a revolutionary way to view the world at the time. So when communism first came around, it was undoubtedly blue ocean. They did things, they redefined the paradigm. They redefined the way to view the world. This was not like two traditional countries fighting each other, like Britain and France, that were playing by the same rules, benchmarking against each other. The communists were thinking in a completely different way. Same thing in the 1960s, progressivism back then was undeniably revolutionary blue ocean thinking compared to the conservative red ocean status quo. I mean, for example, most countries back then revolved around marriage, right? If you wanted to have intercourse, it was an expectancy that you would get married. A man marries a woman, you become husband and wife, then you can have intercourse, start a family, right? The progressives said, why not free love, right? It's Austin Powers. Groovy, people just do whatever they want. Birth control, abortion, people just go crazy. Marriage, that's for squares, man. Who needs that? They just go crazy. Again, gender roles. Men worked, women stayed at home, looked after the offspring, looked after the house, etc. Progressives said, no, why don't we just let everyone do whatever they want? Women can work, men can stay at home, women can stay at home. Again, whatever you think about this, whether you approve or disapprove, that's not the point. The point is, this was a very original way, a very revolutionary way to think. Same thing with, war was pretty standard back then, right? Really, I mean, God, in the 1960s, it was just a stone's throw away from World War II, the biggest war in human history. You had Vietnam going on at the time. You had World War I just a few decades before. War was the standard. War was, you had government ministries called like the Ministry of War. War was just like an expectancy. The progressives, you had the Beatles, John Lennon, give peace a chance. They tried to, wearing the peace symbol all over the place, ban the bomb, man. It was a completely different paradigm. Protesting the draft. Again, this was very, very original. The young people before the 1960s, if they were told to go to war, they did it. There was no questioning it, generally speaking. It was the 1960s and the boomer generation that really protested this. It was revolutionary for the time. And same thing in the 1990s, neoliberalism was undeniably revolutionary blue ocean thinking compared to communist and conservative red ocean status quos. If you think during the Cold War was half the world was under economic socialism, right? The Soviets and their satellite states, and half the world was under social conservatism, right? America, Western Europe. And the neoliberals came in the 1990s and said, screw it, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do social progressivism, economic capitalism, and we're just going to roll with it. And that was revolutionary in the directly post-Cold War era. It just hadn't been done before, really. It just wasn't really on people's minds. And in the 1770s, so we're going really back now, libertarianism. Undeniably revolutionary blue ocean thinking compared to the conservative red ocean status quo. Now, to be clear, I'm obviously using the founding of the United States as an example of libertarianism. I am not saying that the United States is necessarily a libertarian country, especially today, but what I am saying is that it has much more libertarian elements than most other countries on Earth. I mean, for example, most countries that back then they had big governments, kings, emperors, very powerful governments. The United States said, why don't we have a small government? Why don't we have a government that's limited, limited powers? We the people, right? Back then, governments dictated the national doctrine. We tell you what to think, we tell you what to say, we set the agenda, right? The United States said, First Amendment, freedom of speech. We're going to let people say whatever they want. You can even make fun of the president. You can make fun of the government, right? That was for the 1770s. That is revolutionary thinking. That was that was a huge deal back for the time. Same thing with, state enforcement. Back then, if you needed help, you went to a guard, you went to the police. Only the state had guns. Only the state had weaponry. Or the military. Americans said, Second Amendment, why don't we let the citizens arm themselves? They can defend themselves. They don't need to rely on the state for their own safety. Again, this is revolutionary thinking for the time. I would only say that only conservatism has never been in a blue ocean, mostly as it's simply the natural default of human beings more so than an actual ideology. I mean, if you think about it, let's say a nuclear war happened and we entered some sort of fallout post-nuclear world where, the country's fallen apart and, society is now essentially like a bunch of warlords walking around. What kind of government do you think that those tribes would be under? Do you think they'd be under progressive government? Do you think they'd be under a libertarian government? No, they'd be under a conservative type of government, probably a fascist-style government or some sort of religious cult or something. Conservatism really is natural, and like it is the natural default for human beings if they don't contemplate, any other form of ideology. It's natural, hence its name. And so, you can't really say that conservatism is blue ocean. It's some sort of revolutionary idea. Even in times like, the 2010s, 2020s, which in the Western world were much more progressive and conservatism was quite unpopular. Conservatism, even in those conditions, is not blue ocean. It's just unpopular. It's not like it's unknown, like people don't know what conservatism is. It's just that they know what it is and they just reject it. But that's not, I think it's impossible for conservatism to be blue ocean. I think that's impossible. Conservatism is flat out red ocean. It's the only exception. So, almost all of the 5 major political factions were at some point revolutionary blue ocean ideas, original, completely out of the realm of normal status quo thinking. But is that still true today? Right? I mean, well, let's go through that. As communism was tried and tested across numerous nations, both big and small, throughout the 20th century, it's obviously no longer blue ocean, right? I mean, we know what communism is. Right, we know what communism looks like. We've had the Soviet Union, we had Mao's China, we've had Cambodia, we've had North Korea, we've had Cuba. We've got numerous examples from numerous different countries and numerous different continents. We know what communism is, what it looks like, what it leads to. It's no longer a matter of originality. It's no longer a matter of theoretics. In fact, communism is viewed really as a sort of a past from something from the past era. It's not something that's really taken seriously today. You don't really see people calling themselves communists anymore. They might call themselves socialists, perhaps, but very rarely a communist. It's something that's viewed as old, even, really. So it's certainly not blue ocean anymore, though it once was. It is red ocean. Mostly red ocean with the blood of its victims, but I digress. And progressivism, same thing, right? Progressivism is currently, in the 2020s, the status quo social ideology of the majority of the elite across the Western world. It's obviously no longer blue ocean, right? We know what progressivism looks like. It's no longer theoretical. It's no longer unpopular. It's everywhere in the Western world. If you live in the UK, Germany, Sweden, United States, Canada, you live in a more socially progressive country than a socially conservative country, right? I mean, this is no longer in the matter of theoretics, right? I mean, we know what socially progressive countries look like. Neoliberalism, same thing. Neoliberalism is currently the most powerful, all-encompassing ideology of the Western world. So it's obviously no longer blue ocean. I mean, every country in the Western world is pretty much socially progressive and economically conservative. There are very few exceptions. Even when resistance sort of populist governments, whether left wing or right wing, get elected, they still find themselves constrained by, the neoliberalism, the neoliberal institutions that have set themselves in ice, right? No, I mean, obviously, neoliberalism is the most reddest ocean of all the red oceans, right? It is, it's obviously in there. And as libertarian values determine the core constitutional amendments of the current world's most powerful nation, it's obviously no longer blue ocean. I will give libertarianism some credit. It is rare in the vast majority of the world to see libertarian values. But considering its prominence in the United States and the core of its constitution revolving around such values, I don't think that you can make the argument that libertarian is in a blue ocean. I would say it's much more red ocean, much more original and unpopular than the other ideologies I just spoke about. But it's still red ocean. We know what it is. And of course, conservatism, as we discussed, is obviously red ocean. So put simply, it's become clear that all of the 5 major political factions are, as of the 21st century, competing against each other in red ocean waters. We know what they look like, right? They compete against each other in elections. We know what they are, and these ideologies are stagnant. They've been the same for, these are not 21st century ideas. They've been the same last century, in some cases the century before it. We know what these ideas are. We know what these ideologies lead to, what they look like, the kind of societies that they produce. These are not original ideas, right? These are not unknowns. These are knowns. We know what they are. They are red ocean ideas, right? So the question is then, what is currently stirring out of sight and out of mind of most people, just waiting to emerge in the blue ocean? What is the next blue ocean ideology? What is the next communism, the next progressivism, the next libertarianism, the next neoliberalism, the next thing to challenge conservatism, you could say? What is it? Because these are not new. We know they've been tried and tested and implemented. We know what they are. But there's got to be something out there. There's got to be something out there that is unknown at the moment, something that most people don't comprehend or don't talk about, but something that, when it does become noticed, when it does rise to prominence, will threaten the red ocean and the ideologies within it. It will be a revolution, similar to the car threatening the horse, the smartphone threatening the computer, the large language model threatening the search engine. There's an ideology or some series of ideas out there right now as we speak that no one's talking about that will threaten all of these existing ideologies that people currently follow. And so the question is, what is that? And I think that I have the answer. Whatever it is, it will likely follow the trend. Stagnation, right? So the ideologies are stagnant. Society's falling apart. It doesn't matter where people turn to, whether they're a communist, a conservative, a progressive, a libertarian, a neoliberal. It seems like no one really has the answers. It seems like we're stagnant. There's something missing from the equation. Well, that's clearly the case today. I mean, is there anyone who would say, oh no, society today is full of original ideas and it's so exciting? And of course not. I think everyone would. I think you would have to be a very special person to not admit that the world is not stagnant ideologically today. But then there has to be disruption. Whatever is in the blue ocean lurking will come about and it will disrupt. People will look at it and go, wow, that's different, that's unique. But they won't embrace it. They'll hesitate. They'll mock it. They'll say, oh, it's just a fad. It's just a joke. It's nothing serious. Most people, the majority of people, will reject it. They'll laugh at it. They'll say that will never become the status quo, right? But then it will be a revolution, right? There'll be, and I don't mean a revolution in a stupid LARPy, people walking around marching with red flags. I don't mean like a revolution in that way. I mean it will be an ideological revolution, as in people will eventually go, hang on, there might be something to this. There might be something to this. And people change their minds. And it goes from hesitancy to acceptance. It goes from rejection to acceptance. And it becomes the new status quo, slowly. That's the trend of all the blue ocean strategies that have been successful. And whatever ideology is lurking in the blue ocean, and it is lurking, it will follow this trend as well. So what is the ideas? Well, after analysing the status quo of the Western world in the early 21st century, I formulated 3 blue ocean foundations, current blind spots that serve as the genesis of much of our current problems that seem inevitable to be increasingly noticed. So these 3 things that I'm about to talk about are things that most people consciously, they don't think about consciously. But on a subconscious level, I think most people know that they're a problem. And they're leading to a lot of problems, but they're blind spots. People haven't articulated this properly yet. But as it starts to become articulated more and more in the future, you will see people's minds start to be swayed away from their current, red ocean ideologies, the 5 major factions that sort of arrest people's minds today, a road to nowhere. And people will sort of pick it up and go, there's something to this. So what are these foundations? Well, let's go through them. The first one is one that I've spoken about in the past. Collectivism over individualism. So let's talk about that. Now, collectivism over individualism. When I'm writing my notes for these lectures, I wanted to give this a simple definition, and the definition that I came up with was the interests of the collective should generally come before that of the individual. Now, the problem with definitions like this is they're just words on a piece of paper, right? What does that mean in practice, however? That's what people really need to know. And so what I want to do is, rather than talk about words, let's understand what I mean by collectivism over individualism by real examples. And we're going to start off with, number 1, value hierarchies via public transport etiquette. Okay, so let's say that you're on public transport, right? And, it could be a train, could be a bus, whatever. And, most people, they're just minding their own business, being respectful, being quiet, waiting to get to their destination, looking out the window. But there's one guy, and there's always one guy, isn't there? There's one guy, and he's got his phone out, and he's just blasting music in public. No headphones, no buds, nothing. He's just blasting music out in public. Probably a song like Where's Your Head At by Basement Jaxx. If you follow my Spotify, you'll know the song. He's probably playing that out in public. One of those songs that when you're the one who puts it on, it's pretty nice. But when you hear someone else listening to it, it's just nauseating. Right? So he's out there, in public, listening to the music, disturbing everyone else. And everyone else, they're like, they've got their arms crossed, they're huffing and puffing, they're going, can you believe this guy? Can you believe? But no one wants to say anything, right? Because they're cowards. But now all of a sudden, this woman, a brave woman appears, and she points at the guy, and she says, shut it up, man. What are you thinking? You're on public transport. Shh. Do you have no respect, right? The guy turns around and he says, hey, buzz off. He probably uses more colourful language than buzz, I'll be honest with you. But he says, buzz off. Get out of here. Right, well, in this scenario, who is in the right? Right? And your answer, whether it's the woman or the man, all depends on the composition of what I call your value hierarchy, right? So what's a value hierarchy? Well, when it comes to 2 values, let's just take 2 values, freedom or harmony. Which one's more important to you? Right, well, to some people, freedom is more important than harmony, as in the freedom of the individual to do what he or her wants to do is more important than the harmony of the society at large, the cohesion of the society, right? That doesn't mean that the people who value freedom don't want any harmony. It's not like they're anarchists, they only care about themselves, but it's that they view freedom as more important than harmony, right? And these people were what we would call individualists, right? So these are people who, they care more about their own rights, what they're allowed to do, than the collective harmony of society. Whereas the opposite of that, those who prefer harmony, harmony is higher up on their values hierarchy than freedom. That doesn't mean that they don't care at all about freedom, right? That they want to be told what to do all the time. No, they care about freedom, but harmony is more important than freedom. We would call them collectivists, right? People who care about the collective. And so in this scenario then, if you take, the man playing the music and the woman telling him to shut up, individualists would say that the man playing the music is in the right. And they would say something like, he has just as much a right as anyone else, right? If he wants to go on public transport and play his music and you don't like it, that's your problem. That's not his problem. You can play music as well if you want to, and so can he. It's public transport. It's all our transport. It's not yours, right? Just because you're annoyed, and even if the majority are annoyed, that doesn't change anything. The individual is the most important thing to the individualist. The rights of the individual is the most important thing to the individualist. But the collectivists, they wouldn't tolerate that at all. The collectivists would say that the woman is in the right. And the logic would be that 99 people shouldn't have to suffer because of one person. If there's 99 people on the public transport and one man is disturbing them by playing all the music, that one man should be silenced, right? He should be thrown off the public transport. He should be banned from the public transport, maybe even fined. Some would even be harsher than that. Some would even say, if this is his third time doing this, put him in jail, right? Collectivists want to use the state to ensure harmony and have laws that ensure harmony, even if the individual is affected, right? Now, interestingly, the biggest indicator of support for individualism or collectivism is actually geography, because in what we would call the West, which would be, North America, Western Europe mostly, Oceania, right? I would estimate that around 80% of people are individualists, right? So around 80%, especially in the United States, I would say. In the United States, it's probably like 90%. But most people in the Western world are individualists. They don't like the government, the idea of the government limiting their freedom to ensure some sort of collective harmony. They don't like it. Whereas in the East, and I would call the East, East Asia, the Middle East, maybe Africa even, excluding South Africa, I would say the opposite's true. About 80% are collectivist, right? Places like China, Japan, especially, Singapore. So in these countries, there's a sort of social contract, right? It's like, there's a way that you should behave in public, and if you don't behave properly, if you don't respect those around you, if you don't respect societal harmony, if you just want to play by your own rules, you will be ostracized or even punished for that, right? So it's a different way to view the world, right? Now, I'm a Westerner, of course, right? And so I focus on the Western world. And so what that means is that if in the Western world around 80% of people are individualist, then that means that individualism, in a way, is the red ocean. It's the status quo. And that means that collectivism is the blue ocean. It's something that isn't really taken seriously by the majority of the people in the Western world. It's something that is seen as just an odd, strange thing. But the consequences of if you compare, public transport in the West and public transport in the East, they speak for themselves. For example, when it comes to the West, people are loud with almost no pushback. In fact, those who do push back are often mocked for causing a scene. If you use public transport in the UK, I can say that for sure, or maybe in America, parts of America, or parts of Western Europe, you will see people playing music all the time, TikTok, Reels, all these other low IQ apps, full volume, it's an absolute, it's so loud it gives you a headache. Meanwhile, in the East, public transport, you go to somewhere like Japan, China, Singapore, people are quiet, right? They respect those around them. And those who don't are often mocked and punished, right? If you go to Japan, you start playing music on full blast, people are going to give you dirty looks. And they're not just going to give you dirty looks. You will be thrown off the public transport. You might be fined. You can't just start playing by your own rules on public transport in these countries. Putting your legs up on the seats, taking up 2 seats or whatever. You can't do it. They will not tolerate it. It's a totally different society. In the West as well, public transport's often filthy, filled with graffiti, chewing gum and litter. Oh God, it's all over the place. It's generally a rule in the UK that if there's a bus or a train that's over a year old, you can bet your bottom pound that there's going to be some graffiti on the walls, Some guy has scratched his name and the name of his girlfriend into one of the seats. Chewing gum under the seats everywhere. If you're in the UK, look under the seats on a bus or a train. Absolutely filled with it looks like somewhere from Metroid under those seats. It's just like some alien world with all the chewing gum under there. Meanwhile, public transport again in the East, clean, treated as well as their own private property, maybe even better. If you go around littering in public transport in places like China or Japan or Singapore, people will, again, it's considered unacceptable. People will judge you for it. You will be considered dishonourable. You'll be considered a criminal in essence. It's not like people are just going to turn the other way. No, people will say, "What are you doing? Hey, this is my train and my bus as much as it is yours. Have some respect," right? Lastly, in the West, they're often poorly maintained, often late, and avoided at all costs by anyone sane. Take a look at trains in the UK. If you ever take a train in the UK, constantly late, never on time. When people think about taking a train in the UK, it's like, oh God, oh jeez, how late is it going to be today? 15 minutes, 20 minutes, who knows? Meanwhile, places like trains in Japan, they're a source of national pride. They're mostly on time, widely embraced. I've watched a lot of NHK, Japanese television. And, in Japanese train stations, every train station has their own jingle. And people memorize the jingles. In Japan, if a train is late, it is so rare that the train company will print out a certificate for you to give to your boss as proof that the train was late because they wouldn't believe you without it. That's how rare it is for a train to be late in Japan. They need evidence. They need a piece of paper that says, this 1 in a million event actually happened. Can you believe that? The bullet trains are a form of national pride. It's completely different in the Western world, right? The difference between public transport in the West and the East is night and day. But again, that's the difference between an individualistic society and a collectivistic society when sharing public property. It's just a different mindset. Today, this difference in experiences has puzzled the average Westerner, who remains unsure as to the cause. The Westerners, they'll look at Japan, they'll look at China, they'll look at Singapore and they'll go, how do they do this? Why are the trains always on time? Why are they so clean? Why are people so quiet? Why can't we have this? What do they have that we don't have? Right? But it's simply inevitable that a mass eureka moment will occur. We know what the problem is in the Western world. We're individualistic and they're collectivistic. The problem is, however, and the reason why a lot of people haven't realised this, is because many in the Western world suffer from what I call an imperial arrogance when it comes to other parts of the world. And I'm using the British as an example here because I am British, but we in Britain, we are an extremely successful country historically. We had the world's largest empire, colonised much of the world, took over parts of the world. We were the first country to do the Industrial Revolution. We globalised. Is there anyone who would say that Britain is not a historically successful country, forgetting the state that it's in today? Obviously, Britain has been highly historically successful. There's a reason why you watching this, you might not be from Britain, you might not even be from an English-speaking country primarily, but you can still speak English and you can understand me. Well, that's because of the British. It's because of our empire. It's because of our success. We have been historically a massively successful country. But the problem with this is that we're not today. We're not anymore. Today, we're a laughingstock. I don't think there's anyone watching who thinks that Britain is in a good state. Yes, we're in a good state compared to a third world developing country, maybe. But we're not in a good state compared to what we once were. We're a bit of a joke today. But the problem with Britain, and the problem with many Western countries, America, for example, is that because we've been so historically successful compared to other parts of the world, East Asia, for example, Africa, the Middle East, we look at these parts of the world and we think, oh, there's nothing that we can learn from them. No. We're so used to the relationship between us and them in the Western world, the East and the West, let's say, the North versus the South, let's say. We are so used to having a relationship of we are the mentor and they are the protege, they are the pupil. They learn from us, right? Because that has been the relationship for the last few hundreds of years. We have taught many other parts of the world about industrialization, globalization, how to deal with their economy, how to set up democracies and all this stuff, to the point where we cannot fathom. We have become so arrogant to think that maybe, just maybe, places like China could teach us something. Maybe Singapore could teach us something. Maybe even parts of Africa and the Middle East could teach us something. No, that to the average person in the Western world, that makes them laugh. It makes them chuckle. Are you joking? What could they teach us? We're much richer than them. We're much more stable than them. They don't realise that, yeah, okay, generally speaking, we might be doing better than them economically, for example. But that doesn't mean that there's not some things that we do wrong and they do right. That's what imperial arrogance is. And I believe that when it comes to collectivism, we look at the Chinese, the Japanese, the Singaporeans. I use those countries as an example in particular because I know a lot about them, but other countries as well. You could use the religiosity of the Middle East, for example, or the collectivistic ways of Africa, for example, much less individualistic. We look at these other parts of the world and we go, there's nothing we can learn, right? But that is that is arrogance, in my opinion. Because the truth is that there's a lot that we could learn by looking at other parts of the world that we have historically done better than, but may not necessarily be doing better than in the present. And so what it's about is question the criticism. When most people in the Western world hear the words collectivism, what they say is something like, they're totalitarian control freaks. Like they look at countries like China, Singapore, Japan. They say that they're totalitarian, especially China. But hang on a minute, because, authoritarianism is not the same as totalitarianism, right? These are two completely different things. Totalitarianism is where a government has total control over their people. Total control. They have a monopoly of power. This would be Orwellian, like an ink sock Orwellian regime where the government, like Pol Pot's Cambodia would be a totalitarian state. The government decides what colour of shirt you wear. The government decides what colour of walls you have. North Korea is the same way. The government decides everything. But that's a totalitarian regime. An authoritarian regime is just that the government uses its authority to sort of ensure societal harmony, even if that means that they have to sacrifice some individual freedoms to do so. But those are not the same thing. You can't say that China is the same thing as North Korea. Singapore is the same thing as, Pol Pot's Cambodia. You know what I mean? It's like, no. These are two very, very different states in a way. And so people in the Western world need to learn that. They need to learn that authoritarianism, the government trying to ensure societal harmony by sacrificing some individual rights, is not the same as George Orwell's 1984. It is not North Korea. It is not Pol Pot's Cambodia, right? It is not the Soviet Union. Authoritarianism is much more mild than totalitarianism. No one wants a totalitarian regime unless you're some sort of masochist, some sort of crazy person. But an authoritarian regime, it is very easy to understand why someone would want that, actually. There are some benefits to authoritarianism. We don't think about that in the Western world. That is a complete blind spot. And so you have to understand the point. When people in China, people in Singapore, people in Japan, they look at us in the Western world and they say that we're more like freedom fighters. Not freedom. Because the reality is that too much freedom can, in fact, be a negative. Where do you draw the line between individual freedom and collective harmony? We do draw the line somewhere. For example, it's pretty much illegal in every Western country to go outside naked. You can't just start swinging your genitals around outside, can't you? Anywhere you want. No, we've decided, no. There's got to be some level of collective harmony. That's an individual freedom that you can't have. Okay, so, we do accept that freedom isn't everything. That freedom is a universal good. We do accept a certain level of societal harmony over freedom. So if we can accept that, why can we not accept more harmony and less freedom? right? I mean, at some point, freedom does become dumb, right? I mean, if you just let everyone do whatever they want and there's no harmony at all, well, that's ridiculous. You just have anarchy at that point. You don't even have a country. Should we have an open border because that's freedom, right? Just let anyone in. That's freedom. It's also pretty dumb as well, right? Like, should we make every drug legal? Oh yeah, everyone can just do whatever they want. Well, that would be really dumb as well, right? At some point, freedom becomes freedom, right? And I think that people in the Western world need to realize that more harmony and less freedom. Again, these 2 points go hand in hand. More harmony and less freedom, a more authoritarian, not totalitarian society, is not George Orwell's 1984. The Eastern countries, specifically of East Asia, prove this point very well. China is not necessarily a dystopia. Singapore is certainly not a dystopia. Japan is not a dystopia. There is an alternative way of doing things, right? But that requires changing your value hierarchy and not just shutting down, authoritarianism as totalitarianism. Oh, it's Orwellian. No, hang on. Let's think logically. Where should the line be drawn between freedom and harmony? Where's the balance there? Because there clearly is a balance, right? And I don't think that we've got it right. And I believe that as the negatives of individualism continue to fester, we will see people in the West start to recompose their value hierarchy in response. I think the amount of people who value freedom over harmony, the individualists, will decrease over time, and the amount of people who value harmony and freedom will increase over time, the collectivists. Essentially, collectivism will reign supreme over individualism as time goes by and people get sick and tired, for example, of, as we used in the example, a lack of public etiquette on public transport, right? Litter, graffiti, noise, pollution. I think that as time goes by, more and more people will go, why does it have to be this way? It's not that way over there. Why is it this way here? Right? I think that's inevitable. But let's use another example. Ripple effects via the drug trade. So I've spoke a lot about the founding father of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, and his quote on drug dealers. And he said, and I've said this quote before, but I like it, and he said, I would kill them 100 times over if I could, referring to drug dealers, right? Now, why would Lee Kuan Yew say that? Why did Lee Kuan Yew and the Singaporean government have a zero tolerance policy, and still does to this day, on the drug trade? If you go to Singapore and you take a certain amount of drugs, you've signed your death certificate. They will 100% hang you. Pretty much, it's pretty much guaranteed. You're not going to get out of that. But why? What's their logic? Why do they do this? And the answer is the ripple effect. I'm sure when you were young, you probably went to a park or something like that, like a pond, and you took a stone and you threw the stone in the pond, and it does this plop, right? You can see the plop. But it doesn't just plop, does it? It doesn't just plop and then go away. It causes this ripple effect, this circle around the plop, right? And that's called the ripple effect. Well, the ripple effect is actually a really good metaphor for the drug trade and its effects in society, right? Because, for example, what would the plop be in the drug trade? Well, the plop, of course, is the drug addict. It is the drug addict who is addicted to drugs, and he goes to the drug dealer, and he buys the drugs from the drug dealer, and he's addicted. He or she has to keep going back to the dealer to get their fix, because without it they have withdrawal, they go insane. Well, they're obviously the biggest victim of the drug trade, the addicts themselves, because it destroys their lives, kills them physically, kills them mentally, kills them spiritually even. It completely, anyone who's ever known someone who's addicted to drugs, it ruins their lives, right? Especially the harsh drugs, So they're obviously the biggest victim. But that's not, so we'll put them right in the middle. But that's not the only victim of the drug trade, There are other victims. For example, in the sort of primary ripple, you could say, well, it's the friends and family of the drug addict. Because it's well known that drug addicts, they tend to steal money from their friends and their family, especially their families, right? What if your son and daughter is a drug addict? Are you just going to not care about that? Of course you're going to care about that. It's going to drive you sleepless. What if they just die one day? Or, God forbid, what if your parents are drug addicts? What if it's like, that scene in Breaking Bad, if you know what I'm talking about, right? Well, if your parents are drug addicts, you're not going to be looked after properly. Or if only one of your parents are drug addicts and the other one is a drug addict and the other one isn't, well, it's pretty much a guarantee that there's going to be a divorce or they're going to break up, right? So that's another broken family, right? Drugs have destroyed a family. It's a nightmare. So again, that the sort of secondary, the victims of the drug trade is not just the addict, it's the friends and family of the addict. But that's not all either, because in the sort of secondary ripple, you could say, there's wider society at large. If drug addicts are going around thieving people, well, that drains the police attention, it drains police time, right? More and more of the media are going to have to, and academics are going to have to pay more attention to the drug trade and distract away from other problems in society because it's causing too many problems, right? It also funds criminal mafias, right? I mean, drug dealers, they're often, they can sometimes be on their own, but they can sometimes be part of a mafia, a criminal organization that funds lifestyles of luxury from other people's misery. And that causes, naive young people to want to become dealers themselves. Right, so this creates a huge ripple effect on society. The drug trade doesn't just destroy the addicts; it destroys the friends and family. It destroys the wider society at large. It detracts away from other problems. It causes other problems. This whole, the drug trade destroys nations, and that's why Lee Kuan Yew wanted, and the Singaporeans at large wanted, a zero tolerance policy to the drug trade. Same thing with the Chinese. The Chinese understand the damage of the drug trade very well because of the Opium Wars. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole different story, but they understand it very well, right? And so the collectivist understands this. They understand that the actions of an individual don't just affect them, but ripple out into society as a whole. Hence why when it comes to drug dealers, as I just said, Lee Kuan Yew believed that the death penalty is often desired. So collectivists, they don't view the individual drug addict in a vacuum. They understand the ripple effect. But on the other hand, the individualist views all actions within a vacuum, either unaware or outright rejecting the ripple effect entirely. Hence why when it comes to drug dealers, they actually opt for legislation for free tax, right? So individualists, they think that if someone becomes a drug addict, that doesn't affect anyone else, it just affects them. It's their individual right, it's their decision. If people want to do drugs, they should be allowed to do so, damn it. The individualist doesn't see the damage it does to their friends and family, or the distractions from the police or the media or academia, or how it essentially incentivizes other forms of criminality. They don't care. It's not even that they don't care, they don't even see it. They don't even recognize it. In fact, as I said, they actually think that rather than keeping drugs an illegal industry, why not make it legal? Right? And the individualist thinks that if you make all the drugs legal and you tax the drugs, that'll be a boon for society because you'll get more tax revenue coming in rather than it being in black markets. What they don't realise is, yes, that's true. If you made drugs legal, you would have a big spike in tax revenue to start with. And then that tax revenue would disappear because the drug addicts would end up losing their jobs, ending up on welfare, committing more crimes. Drugs destroy societies. There has never, ever been a society in human history where drugs, hard drugs, harsh drugs, have been widely available. And it's been a good thing for society. People are like, wow, this is awesome. This is a great... No, it destroys societies. But again, the individualists, they don't understand the ripple effect. They view all individual actions in an atomized bubble. Like, how does it affect you? If someone wants to do coke, how does it affect you? Well, actually, it does affect me. What if it's my friend? What if it's a family member? What if the police are distracted because they're dealing with trying to bust him and bust some dealer? Or maybe he's off. Even if it's legal, he's off his head and he's trying to steal money from some store. What if that's my friend's store? What if it's my store? Right, again, the individualist doesn't understand the ripple effect. And again, likewise, as the negatives of individualism continue to fester, we will see people in the West start to accept the ripple effect response. I do believe that the amount of people who ignore or reject the ripple, the individualists, will decrease, and the amount who accept the ripple, the collectivists, will increase, because as society, the Western world is extremely individualistic, and as people start to realise, let's analyse, the drug trade, or even the adult industry The adult industry is another example of the ripple effect. That it destroys society via a ripple. As more and more people start to analyse these problems, more and more people will start to accept the ripple and accept the need for collectivism. And a last example of this would be what I call Cog Theory, by the death of Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs, as many people know, was the CEO of Apple during its golden era, particularly the 2000s, where they launched the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, etc. But Steve Jobs, despite being a very successful businessman, a billionaire, he has a bit of a reputation, or had a bit of a reputation, for being, to put it bluntly, a bit of a douchebag. Right? He was very, very difficult to work with, very, very strict. He was prone to having angry fits at people, yelling at people, firing people. He was a very, very unpleasant person to work with and be around, as stated by pretty much everyone who ever worked with him. And Steve Jobs, he was considered quite a selfish guy. I mean, there's pretty well known that Steve Jobs, he had a daughter who he denied was his for many years, and the daughter and the mother of the daughter was on welfare, while this guy was a millionaire. Right? He just rejected her existence for a long time. He was Steve Jobs for a lot of his life was a very selfish guy. He didn't really care about how his words and actions affected other people. He was a very narrow-minded, laser-focused on his business, laser-focused on Apple. But then he got diagnosed with cancer, pancreatic cancer. And, of course, he would die from that. But before he died in 2010, about a year before he died, Steve Jobs wrote a mail to himself. And I think this mail is quite interesting, coming from him. And what it said was, "I grow little of the food I eat, and of the little I do grow, I did not breed or perfect the seeds. I do not make any of my own clothing. I speak a language I did not invent or refine. I did not discover the mathematics I use. I am protected by freedoms and laws I did not conceive of or legislate and do not enforce or adjudicate. I am moved by music I did not create myself. When I needed medical attention, I was helpless to help myself survive. I did not invent the transistor, the microprocessor, object-oriented programming, or most of the technology I work with. I love and admire my species, living and dead, and am totally dependent on them for my life and well-being." And this is a very, very fascinating admission, in a way, from a man like Steve Jobs. And the fact that he felt the need to send this mail to himself proves that he must have found it particularly profound, a particularly profound realization for himself. And I call this sort of realization, this idea, that you are actually you are an individual, but you as an individual are actually responsible for very little of your own success. You are part of a greater machine. I call this Cog Theory. And the idea is that you're a cog, right? You've got to imagine yourself as a cog. But you are surrounded by other cogs, and some are bigger than you, some are smaller than you. But these cogs, they all work together. And they all form this beautiful machine known as society, humanity, right? And, one cog on its own, what's a cog going to do? What use is one cog? Just a cog. But it's when you put the cogs together, do they work together and create this beautiful machine, right? And I know it sounds like, many people would say that's a very dispiriting metaphor, a very, almost dehumanizing metaphor, like, oh, I'm a cog. Whoa, nice, right? Like, no one really wants to think of themselves as a cog. But it's actually quite a nice way to think, because it means that you can be grateful to humanity. You can be grateful for the words that, as Jobs said, the words that you were given, the language you were given, the clothes that you were given, the house that you probably didn't build, the money, the monetary system that you probably didn't make. Too many of us view ourselves as the be-all, end-all. Me, I. But actually, you as an individual, you're part of a much greater machine. You're a cog in a machine. And that doesn't necessarily have to be dispiriting or dehumanizing. In fact, it can actually be awe-inspiring. It can be amazing. Like, wow, my species, humanity, is so much greater than me. And that doesn't make me bad. I'm a part of this too. I can add to this. I can add to the machine. But wow, people are wonderful. People are amazing. I'm so grateful to be a part of this species. That's Cog Theory. It's not something negative. Most people would see it as something negative in the Western world, calling yourself a cog. But it's not. If you see it from the other side, it's actually a very beautiful thing. Like, wow, I'm part of this amazing thing that's way better than me. That's beautiful in a way, right? And so, overall then, it is clear that prioritising collectivism over individualism is currently a blind spot in the Western world that is just waiting to be changed. Hence why it is a clear blue ocean foundation for the 21st century. I believe, no doubt about it, that throughout the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s and the rest of the 21st century, collectivism in the Western world that's currently a blind spot will be noticed. And individualism that is currently the unquestioned status quo, the red ocean, the way that it simply is, people will start to question, is this really the right way to do things? Right? I think that is inevitable. Hence why it is one of my foundations. However, with all that said, we must note to sort of counterbalance. Too much collectivism and too little individualism can quickly devolve into mob rule, artistic sterility, and even a tattletale gossip state, right? So if you take, for example, a scenario where there's one guy and 99 guys, and the 99 guys, they want to hang the one guy, right? Now, the one guy hasn't done anything wrong, which is probably why he looks really upset there, right? He's not done anything wrong. Technically, that's a form of collectivism, right? Because the 99 get what they want, and the one person, the individual, is ignored. But that's really mob rule, isn't it? Right? That's mob rule. That's not a society that is a good society, right? That's not a healthy society where a majority can just group together like a gang and say, get him. That's not a good society to be in. That's a very dangerous society. Not only that, but artists. Artists are often people who challenge the status quo, right? They're very original. They dress originally. They speak originally. They make original music. A society that's very collectivistic can poo-poo artists, can demonise artists, rather than celebrating artists, celebrating innovation. That's dangerous. Society can become stale and boring. And you don't want a state where people are paranoid, like, you won't believe what this person did, blah, 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 right, for breaking some sort of societal convention. Japan is like that very much, In Japan, they have all these thousands of social rules, and if you don't follow the social rules, then people will go, God, can you believe that he didn't follow the rule? What a freak, That's not a very good society to be in either, right? And so, in a state like this, you do have to recognise that the individual, while collectivism should be more important than individualism, that doesn't mean that the individual has no rights, right? There has to be a minimum requirement of dignity and respect that the individual gets. Some people would call these human rights. I don't really like that term because I think that human rights have been warped in the 21st century to mean things like, people think that you have a human right to live in any country you want. That is completely false. I prefer the term individual guarantees, right? You have to have some individual guarantees that people are allowed to, not be the victim of a mob rule, to express themselves artistically, and to be free from, tattletale gossip. There is a fine line. It's not like collectivism is great and individualism is bad. It's more that collectivism should be more important than individualism, but some individualism is still required, right? That's very important to note. And so that is the first Blue Ocean Foundation, which brings us on to number 2, which is what I call pragmatism over emotion. So let's talk about that. So again, my definition in my notes of pragmatism over emotion was doing what is right, determined via hard facts and data, over what feels right, determined via populism or trends. But again, words, right? Let's instead use some real examples to understand what I mean by pragmatism over emotion. And let's start off with how progressives fail due to malfunctioned empathy. And I'm going to use progressives as an example because I think they are one of the most potent of the 5 major political groups today. All of the 5 major political groups have problems, but let's focus on progressives here. So it's a pretty well-known fact that progressives and mental illness tend to go hand in hand. And I'm not just saying that to be rude or disrespectful. It is genuinely true. Psychologists will know exactly what I'm talking about. For example, Progressives are significantly more likely to report higher rates of depression and anxiety, significantly more likely to self-harm or even question their existence, significantly more likely to be medicated for mental ailments, right? Antidepressants, SSRIs. It's a unusually well-known fact. So the question is then, well, why? Why are progressives tend to be much more mentally ill than non-progressives? And the answer, I think, is that almost all progressives have malfunctioning empathy that I call split empathy, right? So empathy normally serves as a mutually beneficial survival tactic, right? So, the purpose of empathy means that you feel sorry for people when things aren't going well for them, right? It's like, oh, God, I really feel sorry for these people. I hope that they get better. And the idea behind that is you feel sorry for other people. You empathize with other people in the hopes that when you're down, they empathize with you. It's a mutually beneficial transaction. You scratch their back, they'll scratch yours. That's the hope anyway. So it's a survival tactic, right? And empathy is a good thing, right? If you had no empathy, people might not have your back, right? People might take pleasure in your destruction. So it's a good thing to have empathy. The problem, however, with progressives is they tend to have a malfunctioning split empathy, right? And you can see here that the backgrounds are both black and white. There's a term called black and white thinking, right? Where people see the world in a binary 0 or 1 way, black and white way. There's no middle ground. There's no grey area. It's either good or bad, right? And progressives are like this when it comes to empathy. For some people, they have loads of empathy. It makes them really upset to hear the problems that some people have. And progressives will spend so much time talking about those problems, bending over backwards to help them out. Whereas with other people, progressives will have no empathy at all. In fact, they'll get angry that you seek empathy. How dare you seek empathy? And they will be extremely angry and spiteful towards them. An example of this would be, an example of progressive split empathy would be women's concerns versus men's concerns, how women's concerns are treated over men's concerns. Progressives, for example, when they hear about women's concerns, the problems that women face, and there are problems, violence, for example, progressives will bend over backwards and they will be very upset to hear about women's problems. Oh, you poor thing! This is terrible. I can't believe what these men are doing to you. Oh, it's absolutely horrendous, and rightfully so in many ways, right? Again, it's not like women don't have problems; they do. But progressives, again, so much of progressivism is talking about women's concerns, women's problems. But meanwhile, when men have concerns of their own, the progressives will say, what? Excuse me, you're a man and you have problems with women? But incel, you're an incel, you're a dork, you're a patriarch, you're an oppressor. And that word oppressor is really the root here. Progressives view the world in a culturally Marxist framework of oppressor versus oppressed. And the oppressed, they're the ones who get all the empathy. But the oppressors, they get no empathy, right? Because they're oppressors. Why would you empathize with oppressors? And women, when it comes to gender, women are viewed as the oppressed and men are viewed as the oppressors, right? And so this is why progressives, they will use terms like believe all women, right? If a woman says that she's been hurt, believe. Not take the accusation seriously. No, believe. You must believe all women. Now, because to a progressive, the idea that a woman would lie is considered absurd. These are poor, oppressed people. They're not going to lie. They're victims. But the idea that a man might have problems, or might be innocent, or might, or might actually have a genuine concern, it's considered absurd. Right? Progressives don't treat men as people who might have problems. They treat men as problems, right? Walking problems, right? And this is any man, specifically young men, men between the ages of 18 to 30. If you've ever interacted with a progressive or progressive movements, you will know exactly the difference between how men and women are treated, right? Another example would be pride parades versus public onlookers, right? So, there are pride parades where gays and lesbians, bisexuals, come together and they do these marches, right? And it's usually in June, which is the sort of Pride month. And it's, mostly just people, waving rainbow flags around and, getting to meet other people who are like them, right? And The problem is that at some of these events, some of these parades, people dress in very, very borderline naked ways that are unacceptable, really, to dress in the public sphere, especially around young people, potentially. You've got people like wearing all sorts of strange masks, harnesses, leather, whips, all sorts of things that typically, if there was one guy walking around like this, people would call for him to be arrested. But however, when it's a large group, suddenly that goes out the window. And you've had a lot of people, public onlookers, mothers of young people, for example, who will say, hey, hang on a minute, I'm not really happy with what's going on at these parades. I think a lot of this behaviour is quite unacceptable, to be completely honest with you. But the progressive, they sympathise with gays, lesbians, and whatnot, because they see them as an oppressed minority. Oh, it's terrible how society has treated you. It's awful, which is right in some ways. But remember, they have a split empathy, so they only empathise with them positively. They say, "Oh, of course you should be able to dress what you want. Of course you should be able to act like what you want. This is your parade. Do what you want," right? Basically. But when the concerned mother comes along and says, hey, I'm a bit concerned about this, there's a guy over there with his balls swinging around, is this really okay in the public? The progressive will say, excuse me, are you a homophobe? Are you someone who wants to put these people in concentration camps and wear a little pink triangle on their jumpsuits? Is that what you want? Meanwhile, the mother might be like, no, I'm not a homophobe. I like gay people. It's just that I think that this is a little unacceptable. I think that, this is all I'm asking is, can they cover up a little bit, And the progressive will go, how dare you? You're just like them. You're basically a Nazi. That's what you are, right? They have no empathy for the public onlookers whatsoever. No empathy at all, right? And a final example would be the lives of immigrants versus the lives of natives in whatever country, but we'll use Western countries as an example. Progressives will sympathise with immigrants. They will say, oh, you poor immigrant, man, your country is in ruin, it's terrible. We need to give you a free house, we need to give you free healthcare, free education, But meanwhile, when the natives turn around and say, well, hey, hang on a minute, I don't have anything against immigrants, but we've got our own homeless people. Why are you giving an immigrant a house when we've got our own native homeless people? Surely they should get a house first, considering they were born here, they've got nowhere else to go. Right? Surely we should be helping our own people get educated, and get jobs, etc., and healthcare, rather than, people who weren't even born here. When the progressive hears the native says that, he goes, excuse me? Sorry, do you think your life is more important than theirs? Sorry, are you some sort of Nazi or something? That's what they say. The progressive simply cannot empathise with the native who feels hard done by, treated like a second-class citizen by his or her own government. They only see the benefits to the immigrants as a net positive. They see it as a universal, that they are so focused on the immigrants' lives that they don't care about the natives' lives, right? And progressive split empathy inevitably always results in enormous backfires. I mean, for example, to take the men versus women, what have we seen? Well, ignorance to men's issues led to the masculine overcorrection, as I call it, including the rise of figures such as Andrew Tate, right? Men feeling like they've got nowhere to go. They listen to Tate, right? They overcompensate for their masculinity. And this can often lead to treating women badly, trying to present yourself as being someone you're not, not wanting to be emotional, let's say, which is normal for men, but taking it to a whole new level. And young men have shunned progressive political parties, so much so that they have even started to lose elections for ignoring the demographic. Yeah, I mean, take a look at America. Right, in America, the American Democratic Party has had a huge, plummeting amount of young men who vote for them because they have ignored men's issues. And in fact, it's so funny to me because I read that the American Democrats, they are trying to, after they lost the election in 2024, they started to, quote, workshop ways, like theory craft ways to appeal to young men and appeal to men in general. And I thought to myself, men are 50% of the population. If you don't know how to appeal to 50% of the population, surely you have a way bigger problem on your hands. I mean, this isn't like the way that progressives talk about men, they talk about them like some sort of lost tribe, like some sort of, how do we appeal to these people? Who are they? It's like, what are you talking about? It's half the population. It just goes to show how much during the 2010s and the 2020s, they just completely ignored men, completely poo-pooed men. And now that they realise they need men, they're trying to sort of reverse engineer the problem, not realising that they are the problem. When it comes to the pride parades versus the public onlookers, a lack of reasonable standards of public behaviour at pride parades, some pride parades, not all, led to viral displays online, damaging the public's view of homosexuals, right? You had people seeing people walking around half naked in front of young people even, and people were disgusted by it. And the result was support for gay marriage and other homosexual-related topics have generally dropped in the early 2020s. If you look at, the millennial generation is much more supportive of gays than the Zoomer generation. It's actually decreased, and that is a mind-blowing thing to progressives because they thought it would just increase. But it hasn't. And it hasn't because a reasonable amount of empathy hasn't been shown. You could say too much empathy has been shown at said parades that good standards haven't been met. And it's a sad thing as well because homosexuals throughout the 90s and the 2000s were stereotyped as being conflated with, molesters, right? And this was a stereotype that you often heard, that, homosexuals were often molesters. And this was this sort of baggage was shed away in the 2010s, but has now started to return again in the 2020s because of some of the displays that people see at these parades, to the point where many homosexuals have actually had to make groups. I believe there was one called Gays Against Groomers, for example, to sort of prove to the public, like, hey, we have nothing to do with this. These people don't represent us. This is people being chaotic. The fact that groups like that even have to be made, or feel like they have to be made, shows, that this was a big error, that progressives have really messed up here. And, and when it comes to immigrants versus natives, right, extreme bitterness over accurate perceptions of different treatments has festered, causing gargantuan sectarianism. Right-wing populist parties have surged in popularity, with many even coming to power. Again, if you spend decades ignoring the native homeless, victims of crime even, the natives treat, healthcare declining, standards of healthcare declining, and the natives hear about how immigrants are given affirmative action or positive discrimination in things like universities, free houses. When of course people are going to become annoyed. People are going to become feel like they're second-class citizens in their own country, because you could say that they are in many ways, right? And so again, progressives, unable to comprehend that they are the reason such consequences occurred, double down, creating a negative feedback loop. Hence why they tend to descend into neuroticism and illness later on in life, when the promised utopia slowly turns into dystopia. This is a really important point. Progressives, they're not aware that they have split empathy, right? They think that they have empathy. They think that they're doing the right thing. They're helping the oppressed and poo-pooing the oppressors, right? They think in black and white ways. It's like I call it their Marvel brain, right? They have a Marvel morality, as I call it, because the Marvel movies, superhero movies, they're designed for young people, and so they have to have simple plot lines, right? There's good guys and bad guys, and that's it. They're not very complicated to understand. Progressives view the world in that way. They view the world like a big Marvel movie. There's good guys and bad guys. There's oppressors and oppressed. And they don't understand that actually life is more complicated than a Marvel movie. This binary thinking doesn't work. You have to be pragmatic rather than emotional, and see that there's a grey area. It's not just like there's good people, bad people. It's that almost everyone has a good point. Almost everyone has genuine concerns. But they don't realise this. If they realised it, they would consciously make the change. They probably wouldn't even be progressive if they realised it. I mean, you could say split empathy is crucial to progressivism as an ideology, right? And so because they don't realise this, because they don't see that they're doing something wrong, when things don't turn out the way that they want it to, they double down. They say, no, the problem is we're not doing enough, right? We need to demonise men more, right? We need to demonise, the onlookers more. We need to demonise the natives more, and we need to help the women and the pride parades and the immigrants more. That's the problem. It's that we're not doing enough. And of course, when they double down, well, the public also double down, so they get more backlash. And slowly but surely, as the years go by, the utopian progressive world that they thought was inevitable slowly turns into the exact opposite, a conservative, populist dystopia, right? And it leaves them mind blown. They don't understand what the problem is. In fact, many of them start to say, well, the problem is because the public are morons. We're the enlightened ones. We're the smart ones. If everyone was as smart as us, the world would be a utopia. Right, that's what they actually think. And this is why they tend to be so mentally ill and so neurotic, I think, especially the older that progressives get, right? You see progressives in their 20s, they tend to be quite happy. You see them in their 30s and 40s, they completely fall apart, right? The world that they were promised, it just doesn't come to fruition. And so progressives, because of their inability to properly regulate their empathetic emotion, often make themselves unfit to govern. Right? The general rule is any progressive government in any country will inevitably result 5, 10, 20 years down the line in a conservative populist backlash. A government that will represent the exact opposite of what they represented. And it's all because of split empathy. But that's just one example. Let's give another example of another major political group. How conservatives fail due to unusually high disgust, right? So it's a pretty well-known fact that conservatives have a bit of an unusual relationship to cleanliness. I mean, conservatives, for example, are significantly more likely to be a germaphobe, significantly more likely to avoid risky intimate behaviour and the infections and diseases that can come forthwith, significantly more likely to critique aesthetics out of their taste, right? All these things, if you look at conservatives, yeah, I mean, you see it, right? But again, the question is then why, right? But why? And I believe it's because almost all conservatives have an unusually high sense of disgust. Now, disgust normally serves as a self-defensive survival tactic, right? I mean, for example, if you're hungry and you see food, like a piece of bread, but upon further inspection, the bread has mold on it and it stinks, right? There's a part of us that makes our stomach churn, right? If you think about yourself eating moldy bread, you feel like throwing up, right? That is a mechanism designed to maximize your survival, right? Bad smells are a warning, like, poo stinks, for example. Why does poo stink? Because it's not good for you, right? You don't want to go near it. It's full of disease, it's waste, right? And so, of course, it pongs for a reason. Disgust is good, right? It's good to feel disgust. Disgust serves as a way for you to survive and stay healthy. But you see, the thing is with conservatives is that conservatives, however, tend to have an unusually high sense of disgust. For example, psychologists have done an experiment where they've hooked up conservatives' brains to like you can scan people's brain waves, and they flash them with visual stimuli. And it's been found that when you flash conservatives with pictures of, say, that's an ant, but I believe the real experiment used maggots, right? If you showed them maggots eating rotting flesh, right, which is obviously a disgusting image that would naturally repulse anyone, right, unless you're very deranged. Conservatives had the same response in the brain to seeing that image as seeing two men kissing. The same disgust, the same revulsion with those two images. Now, other people, non-conservatives, didn't have that, or they didn't have it as much. Progressives didn't have it at all, but conservatives had it very strongly, almost identically. And, this is what I mean by conservatives have a high level of disgust. If you look at conservative attitudes towards homosexuals, men holding hands, men kissing, or whatever, conservative people tend to have, it makes conservative people feel legitimately disgusted in the same way that mouldy bread would, right? It's the exact same reaction. Same thing with attitudes towards things like graffiti, right? Graffiti makes conservatives feel sick, right? To see, pollution or litter, or, it makes people feel like they want to throw up. It makes people feel disgusted. Same thing with attitudes towards abortion, for example. Abortion, never mind if the Conservative is in the room, the mere thought of abortion makes Conservatives lose faith in humanity. It makes Conservatives feel sick to their stomachs, even just imagining the process. To be clear, by the way, I am not saying that Conservatives are wrong when it comes to feeling these feelings of disgust. I'm merely saying that Conservatives differ from the general population in this way. Because conservative high levels of disgust inevitably always result in strict legislation suggestions. So, for example, when it comes to people, Conservatives will say things like ban gay marriage, go to jail for graffiti, or if you have an abortion, you should be given the death penalty. And if you feel a natural sense of disgust to all these things, and again, I stress a natural sense of disgust, you have an unusually high natural sense of disgust, all these legislation suggestions make complete sense because they are formed emotionally. It's an emotional response to the stimuli. But the problem is that the rest of the public, these legislation suggestions, they prove to be very unpopular. People will say that banning gay marriage is hateful, for example. People say going to jail for a graffiti would be an overreaction. People would say that the death penalty for abortion would be shocking, right? And the reason is because the rest of the public, non-conservative people, do not have the same level of disgust as Conservatives. They have disgust. Well, some progressives don't have disgust, actually. But most people have a moderate sense of disgust, but their level of disgust is not as high, okay? And so, to Conservatives, these legislation suggestions make complete sense within conservative circles. You don't need to make the argument. It is it's an emotional, logical response. Well, it's not a logical response, it's an emotional response that seems logical to those who have it. It's not to the public. But this is the thing. So when Conservatives make such emotional responses, they don't do well. But Conservatives tend to do well, however, when they put aside their disgust and instead break down the case for their legislation using logic. Right? So, for example, when Conservatives ask people, what is the point of a marriage? Right? They try to break down marriage like, hey, marriage is it's a financial contract. It's security for the offspring, the son or daughter, to ensure that the parents stay together. It's a lifelong contract to ensure stability. So why would gay people need that if they're not reproducing? Surely that just devalues marriage to be what people think marriage is in the modern era, which is just something that people do at an arbitrary point in time to show that they love each other. Again, that point makes people think. Another example is, should your private property become public? I mean, if you don't mind public graffiti, well, should people be able to graffiti in your house, right? On your house? Maybe people should be able to go in your house and graffiti on the walls. Oh no, you wouldn't like that, would you? So so you don't like it done privately. Why do you like it done publicly? You do realise that public property is your property as well, right? That gets people thinking. Same thing with abortion. When Conservatives ask people, what does an abortion actually entail? And Conservatives tell them, they crush the skull, they snap the limbs, they use vacuum cleaners. You know what I mean? They in places like the UK, it's been known that discarded corpses have been used been thrown into incinerators and heat hospitals, and laws have been passed to ban prayer over the issue. Most people don't think about it in that way. Most people don't think about what an abortion is, the consequences that it has in society. And when the public, is explained these issues in these ways, not guaranteed, but most of the public will say, well, that's an interesting history. I didn't know that about marriage. I see your point about graffiti. Maybe we should be more harsh about it. I had no idea that that's what an abortion actually was. And I'm going to look into that more. That's a bit disgusting, actually, now that you think about it. When Conservatives put aside their disgust and make logical arguments as to why they oppose these things, why they have this disgust in the first place, perhaps, they do much better. Right? Conservatives do much better when they make the logical argument to the general public. But that's very rarely the case, right? It's very rarely the case that Conservatives realise, my sense of disgust is actually much higher than most people. I need to make a logical argument. It's very rare that people do that. And so Conservatives, because of their inability to comprehend differences in disgust, they often make themselves unfit to govern. Conservative governments get in power, they enact laws that are very unpopular, Take restricting abortion, for example. Most people in the Western world that support abortion, conservative governments get in, they will restrict it. It backfires because it riles people up. People don't understand what an abortion really is. What conservatives have to do before they start banning things is they have to make the case to people. They can't just rely on their own disgust. They have to make the logical argument. This is what an abortion is. This is the consequences of abortion. When most people realise that, they'll change their mind. But you can't rely on disgust alone. You have to use logic to get people on board, to bring their disgust levels up to the natural disgust that conservatives have. Until conservatives realise that, they're unfit to govern. Because they get in government and then everything they do gets overturned a few years later. Right? And our last example I'll give is not a political example. It's not one of the major political groups. This is instead what I think a national example, right? An example of an entire nation failing due to emotion. And that would be how Britons fail due to a sacred cow. So in Britain, we have what's called the National Health Service, which is our public healthcare service. But the problem with the NHS is that it's actually a bit of a disaster because it has many problems, such as, for example, waiting lists. Calling an ambulance, you'll be waiting for like an hour or two to get an ambulance. Well, in an emergency, you can't really be waiting an hour or two. Same thing with cancer waiting lists, right? They're a year, 2 years long. You want a dentist on the NHS? Forget about it. You'll be waiting 5 years. Maybe you'll be waiting for 50 years. You know, I have a friend of mine who's waiting on an NHS dentist waiting list. He's been on there for 3 years. He'll probably never be seen. When you go to accident and emergency, you actually go to a hospital physically. They're so swamped that you have people waiting in corridors. There's not enough wards. You go to any British hospital in any urban area, it'll be filled with people, waiting in corridors, beds in corridors. It's just absolutely packed to the brim. And if you go to accident and emergency, you'll be waiting for hours, absolutely hours. You better hope it's not a real emergency. We have a culture of over-prescription. Doctors will often just give out SSRIs like candy because it's much easier to medicate people than it is to actually give them therapy or something like that. It's much easier to just throw people a pill and go, there you are, take that, bye-bye. So we have a culture of over-medication. There's millions of people in the UK that are on antidepressants. Is there really millions of people in the UK who are depressed? Probably not, right? And then, of course, you have the staff at the National Health Service are underpaid. They know it. They work too hard. They know it. There's always strikes. They're never happy. Work satisfaction in the NHS is abysmal. It's just if you talk to people who work in the NHS, they'll tell you it's a nightmare, right? So basically, this healthcare system is a complete and utter disaster, right? I mean, it works in some ways, it works sometimes, but it has major problems, major faults that need to be addressed. So the question you might ask then is, if the NHS is so ineffective, why hasn't it been reformed? Because these problems that the NHS has had, they've been like this for 10, 20 years. So what's going on? Why is it like this? And the answer is that the NHS has become Britain's sacred cow. It's like a national religion. It's the replacement to Christianity in Britain. People talk about the NHS like it's holy. You can't talk if you talk negatively about the NHS in any way in Britain, there will be an army of people who will lambast you. They will say, "How dare you say this about the NHS?" People talk about the NHS like our NHS. There was a time in Britain where people went outside of their homes and clapped for the NHS. They even bought pots and pans and started banging them together. During Corona, they did this because the government told them to do it, and millions of people around the UK did it. I remember hearing people outside. I didn't do it, obviously, because I'm not a buffoon. But I remember hearing people outside, clapping. It was just unbelievable. People treat the NHS in Britain as a sacred cow, a religious icon, something beyond criticism, something that you can't criticise, and because of that, it can't be reformed. Right, because the average Briton is a total simpleton when it comes to healthcare systems. The way that British people view healthcare is that you either have a system like we do in Britain, the National Health Service, which is free at the point of use, right? Because the way that the National Health Service works is that you don't pay for it directly. You pay for it in your taxes, but you never in Britain when you go to a hospital will someone ask for your credit card. Never. It just doesn't happen. right? I think maybe you'll have to pay for your medication sometimes when you go to your GP, but that's about it. And even then it'll be as cheap as chips, right? But you never will you be charged for hospital care in the UK. And people love that. Because people think that that's how a healthcare system should be. And I guess it should be that way, right? Because it's nice. When you're ill, you don't want to be thinking about money. Oh God, how much am I going to have to pay for this ambulance ride? No, British people, of course, love that about the NHS, and who wouldn't? But British people think that the only alternative to a free at the point of use system like the NHS is an insurance-based private healthcare system like what's in the United States. Where, as you can see with a picture, people get these ridiculous bills, medical bills, for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you hear stories about Americans begging people not to call an ambulance for them because they can't afford it and they don't want to get in debt, even if they're bleeding out in the street and they need it. You hear nightmare stories about American women being charged to hold their own son and daughter that they've just given birth to in the hospital. They add extra to the bill. They call it skin-on-skin contact. These things, when the British population hears this, it drives them crazy because they think this is just dystopian, this is disgusting. And it is, of course it is. But what British people don't realise is there is a middle ground. Like, that's black and white thinking. There is a grey area. Take somewhere like Singapore. You can have a mixed mechanics system. You can have it where people can pay for different wards. Rich people can have better wards with nicer beds and more room, and poorer people can share a ward with a worse bed, but it's still okay. And they can get that for free. If people can't afford healthcare, they can have it for free if they can't afford it. But if people can afford it, if people work, if they're millionaires, well, they will be forced to put aside a certain amount of their money, put it into a fund. I think they call it Medisave, right? And then they can pay for their own healthcare out of their own money. And because it's coming out of their own money, they're going to be less likely to waste it, less likely to waste A&E's time, less likely to ask for unnecessary medication because they're the ones paying for it. You can have a mixed system. You can have the best of both worlds, the best of public, the best of private. It doesn't have to be, UK all public or all private. But again, the British public are so scared of American healthcare. They're so paralysed by what they hear coming out of the dystopian United States in this regard that they won't even contemplate any alternative to the National Health Service. And so Britons, because they treat the NHS as a sacred cow, they're forced to deal with a substandard healthcare system. Everyone in Britain knows that the National Health Service doesn't work and doesn't function as it should. It's a skeleton crew, it's a disaster, it has so many problems. But people are so scared of American healthcare that even just tinkering with the NHS slightly drives people to have a panic attack. As soon as you mention money and healthcare to the British people, you've lost them. And so they're just cursed to deal with this system. That's a fantastic example of emotion over pragmatism, rather than pragmatism over emotion. It's just crazy. By the way, but it is inevitable that the NHS collapses and will change. British people can't stop that. British people will, at some point in the future, have to come to terms with the fact that this system that we have doesn't work and needs reform. And they will get it whether they like it or not. But overall then, it is clear that prioritising pragmatism over emotion is currently a blind spot in the Western world that is just waiting to be changed. Hence, why it is a clear blue ocean foundation for the 21st century, right? Westerners are not pragmatic. We're emotional. We don't like pragmatism. We don't like doing the right thing because it's what our brain tells us to do. We like to do the right thing because because of what our heart tells us to do. We don't follow our brains, we follow our hearts. And it shows. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. That's going to change. However, with all that said, we must note, emotions exist for a reason and shouldn't be completely disregarded, as a worshipping of the statistics can slowly result in a chaotic eruption. Neoliberals do this a lot, where they will say something like, the GDP has gone up by 0.2% this year. That means things are better, right? And it's like, not really. Because GDP might have gone up, but what if the GDP went up because you brought in like 200,000 immigrants? What are the rates of home ownership like? Oh, they're declining for the 20th year in a row. What are the rates of mental illness like? On the rise, right? So you can't just take one statistic and worship it. You have to look at the stats as a whole. And not only that, but you have to listen to people. If you make a policy proposal that's the right thing to do, but 99% of people oppose it, and it causes riots, and it causes absolute mayhem, sometimes it might just be better to not do that policy or to reframe the policy, right? Yeah, most of the time you have to go against the emotions. You have to do what's pragmatically correct. But sometimes, you have to listen to the people. You have to listen to the anger or the sadness. You can't just, you can't have a robotic society, a sort of, treating people like they're chess pieces, or like pieces of code that you can manipulate. Sometimes you've got to listen to the emotions because they exist for a reason, right? Not always, not mostly, but sometimes. And that's important to note as well. So that's my second Blue Ocean Foundation. We're on to the last one. And this one's very important. Many people don't think that this one is as important as the other two, but it is. It's just as important. And this is facefulness over facelessness. So let's talk about that. I describe facefulness over facelessness as a person should always rely on the self, friends or family, aka people whose faces they know, over strangers, charities, or the state, aka people whose faces they don't know. But again, that's just words. Let's give real examples to understand, and we're going to use the bubbles this time. Some of you may remember my bubbles concept, you old school viewers. So, you've got to think of the person being involved in bubbles, and these bubbles represent bonds that they have with other people. And, one of the biggest bubbles that people are in is what I call the tribal bubble. And since time immemorial, human beings have been a tribal species, right? I mean, human beings are not designed to be on our own. We love to be in tribes. All throughout history, we have been in small tribes of men and women, different families working together. This is how we are. In fact, when human beings are on our own, which again, we are not designed to do, we feel lonely, right? We actually have an emotion. We have an inbuilt mechanism that says, go and find other people. You're not meant to be on your own, you madman, right? You're a madman. You're not meant to be on your own. And loneliness is a big crisis in the modern era. It's a big crisis in general because we're meant to be in tribes. We're not meant to be on our own, right? And throughout history, religion, such as Christianity in the West, served as the faithful tribal bubble. There's a reason why in England you have these big cathedrals in practically all major places. And as you can see, it's the biggest building. It's the biggest building out of them all. No building is as big as the cathedral. These cathedrals often took decades, sometimes even centuries to build. Sometimes, your grandfather's generation could start building it and the grandson's generation would finish it, right? That's because to religion, religion was people's tribe, right? People went there every Sunday. They knew their priest, right? People believed in the religion. They followed the same rules. That was their tribe. My tribe is Christianity. That was people's tribe, right? Well, until it wasn't people's tribe anymore. Because the decline of Christianity in the West left many without a tribe, lost, seeking other faceless alternatives to fill the void. So people went from going to a church face to face, knowing their priest, knowing the other members of the congregation face to face, to using the internet, faceless, and participating in things. People replaced the church with things like Facebook pages, Reddit subreddits, Twitter feeds, or you could say for young people, Discord servers. And it's in these Discord servers that, people may not necessarily use them as a substitute for religion, but they use them as a substitute for tribe. People use social media, usually in a political method rather than a religious method, to feel like a sense of tribe. Hey, these are my friends, these are my people, hey guys. Meanwhile, in reality, it's a bunch of people they've never met, don't really know. And it's just a simulation of tribe, an unhealthy simulation of tribe that is nowhere near as effective as or as important as the physical church, let's say, the religion of the past. I've spoke about this before in my lecture on the internet, not using the internet for 6 months. And so rather than focusing on its unprovable theological myths, religion must once again be recognised as having a sociological function. One of the big problems during the late 20th century is that we had a bunch of atheists, the fedora tippers, as I often stereotype them as, often unfairly, admittedly. But they just view religion as this backwards, stupid thing. They focus exclusively on the theology. Really believe in Adam and Eve? Dumb, right? But they don't realise that religion has a sociological function. There is a functionalism to religion, and that it gives people community, it gives people hope, it gives people purpose. And even if it is a myth, even if the theology cannot necessarily be proven, does it really matter if it gives people a sense of, if it stops people from being depressed, if it stops people from being, directionless? I suppose it does matter if it gets in the way of you. If you don't believe in religion and you have people forcing the religion on you, then it's a problem. But if they don't force it on you, is it really a problem? And the answer is no. Religion can be a fantastic thing for people. And when you destroy religion like we destroyed Christianity in the West, particularly in the 20th century, what you end up with is people having a void, and they substitute that void with the internet, social media, political tribes, political ideologies, usually red ocean ideologies, like the 5 major ones, as I discussed before. Look at Twitter. Horrible website. Absolutely horrendous website. But it's full of people who use it as their tribe. They think that their followers are their friends. Their feed is their community. They treat it like a church. That's unhealthy. Another bubble would be the family bubble. Because, and of course, the family bubble is very important, being instrumental in our upbringing. I've put at the bottom there a bunch of things that the family does for us. Right? The family provides us love. It gives us a feeling of belonging, financial support, encouragement, religious influence, and emotional regulation. Your family really is such a luck of the draw sort of thing, right? Like if you're born into a good family, man, your life is going to be so much better than if you're born into a bad family. You're born into a bad family, yikes! It's not you're going to have a lot of problems, right? We all know this, right? Like it's a very important thing. But unfortunately, throughout the Western world, many families now look like this. You've got the son, you got the mother, you got the father, you got the daughter. But wait a minute, no father. Right? We have a fatherless crisis in the Western world, where increasingly people are being raised by single mothers, which isn't necessarily the single mother's fault, but there's no father in the picture. The role of the father has been taken in many ways by the state, right? The faceless state. And this was caused by socially progressive attitudes, which especially surged in the 1960s, as I mentioned earlier. Progressives said to men, we want free love. People, guys shouldn't have to marry in order to have intercourse. Like that's for squares, man. No, we should be able to have intercourse with whoever we want, man. Yeah, it's groovy, right? Austin Powers. Whereas progressives said to women, single mothers should have welfare. You shouldn't be reliant on your husband. You should be able to work yourself, but not only that, if you don't get enough, the state should step in. The state can be the daddy. The state can be the new father. Who needs men anyway, right? But see, the problem is, ever since we've had this society where being a father is essentially viewed as this casual thing that doesn't really matter. You want to abandon your offspring, go ahead. You grow up without a father. Oh, that's totally normal. It's just an alternative family. Well, it's not really, because the consequences of growing up fatherless in every single Western country are well documented. 2 times more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, 2 times more likely to drop out of high school, 2 times more likely to be incarcerated, 3 times more likely to be in custody, 3 times more likely to commit a violent crime, 4 times more likely to grow up in poverty. We know the consequences of growing up fatherless. If you're watching this and you grew up without a father, you have been put at a severe disadvantage over most people who grew up with fathers. The stats are clear. We know the effects that it has, and yet 50 plus years of decaying the family unit have proven that the faceless state cannot replace the faceful father. Having a man, a physical man, a face, your flesh and blood in your life that you can go to is much more important than a faceless state ran by bureaucrats from a central government who throw welfare chips at you and pretend like it's okay and pretend like that's all a man is. All a man is a wallet. All a man is money. That's not true. Fathers have a crucial role in bringing their children up, and this is a blind spot in the Western world. Because despite the data, the fatherless crisis, and this has been known for decades. This isn't just like a revelation in the 2020s. This has been known since this crisis started in the 60s. People have been talking about this for decades, and despite the data, it continues to get worse. For example, in 1970, 21%, so almost a quarter back in 1970, of youths in England did not live with both biological parents throughout their upbringing. Do you know what this number is? It was in 2022. You won't believe it. 44%. Right? 44% of youths in England did not live with both biological parents throughout their upbringing. And, 44% is a shocking number, but you've got to think, well, If this demographic trend continues, by 2040 it could be over 50%. We could get to a point in the 2040s, or maybe even earlier, where having a father is considered a privilege. There will be more young people who grow up without fathers than not, right? Than have fathers. That is, imagine a world when we know the consequences of fatherlessness, where having a father is a privilege. That is absolutely mind-blowing, if you think about it. And so it's clear that a drastic reversal is needed to turn the situation around, right? And the first thing to do is to ignore progressives and their nonsense. The 1960s view of progressivism and fatherlessness and how the faceless state can replace the faithful father. Get that out of the picture. And we need new ways to think about this. And I believe, and this is controversial, but I believe men who abandon their offspring should be castrated by the state to minimize further reproductive chaos. I don't mean men who have got divorced and they actually still care about their offspring and they stay in their offspring's lives, even if they live in different places, which I still think is a tragedy. I'm talking about the dark tetrad men. The men who impregnate women with no intention to get them pregnant, don't really care if they do, huff and puff and go, oh, just get an abortion. Don't care. Go on welfare. I'm talking about those men. I'm talking about the men who impregnate women and don't care about their offspring and have no desire to look after them. I think they should be castrated. The first time that they impregnate a woman, snip their testicles, right? Because if you want to act like an animal, then you should be treated like an animal. And this isn't just spite. This isn't just me being emotional here. There is a pragmatic purpose to this. And it's because these men, they typically don't just impregnate one woman. They don't just create one single mother. They create many. They do it to 2, 3, 4 women even. Stop at the first, right? Let's prevent women from having to deal with men like this and becoming single mothers, right? Just stop it right at the source. As soon as a man does this, as soon as he's proven that he's not a reasonable man, he's not a father, he has no intention of being a father, we're not going to allow that anymore. I believe that is necessary. Not only that, but with women, those who promote or glorify to women reproduction before marriage should be forced to directly pay for the consequences in welfare. If you're the sort of person who thinks that fathers don't matter, if you're the sort of person who thinks that the state is a replacement to a father, you can pay for it. I don't believe that. I don't want to pay for single mothers. I don't believe that. But if you do, you should pay for it. You can pay for the single mothers. You can raise these offspring, who will often be more prone to crime and drugs and sadness and depression and self-harm. You can fund them. And you can help raise them because you're the one who promotes this kind of lifestyle, who says that reproduction is just a casual thing. Oh, there's contraception, even though it doesn't always work. Oh, there's just abortion, even though it's an absolutely barbaric act. If you believe that reproduction is just a casual thing, you pay for it. You can pay for it, because I'm not paying for it. And nor should anyone else who acts reasonably. But of course, the most intimate bubble of all would be, of course, the partner bubble, right? And as I said, it's the most intimate and intricate of them all. Our other half. There's a reason why people say, the other half. The man's other half is the woman, the woman's other half is the man. It's because everyone wants that one person in their life who just makes them smile and who brings them so much joy. And it's a beautiful thing. But in the past, throughout history, people typically met their partners through faceful means, right? Such as through family, friends, and religion, right? You'd have, your family would introduce you like, hey, my friend knows a woman your age, and they would like to get to know you, or the priests was, you'd meet people at church or whatever, right? That's how most people met their partners, their soulmates in the past, through other people. There was a framework of community, right? Well, in the modern era, however, in the modern era, such associative frameworks have been long neutered, right? People don't really go to church now. You don't meet your partner in church. Family doesn't introduce you to people. That'd be considered weird. It'd be considered almost immature. Same with friends. You don't meet your partner through friends. It's considered weird. I mean, you can do sometimes, but mostly no. As a result, people now turn to faceless means like technology to be their matchmaker because you're on your own. Right? If you're a man or a woman in modern society growing up in the Western world, no one's going to find you a wife or a husband. Right? You're on your own. It's almost viewed as laughable. Nope, you're on your own, you've got to do it yourself. And so what do people do? They turn to technology to be their matchmaker. So-called dating apps, or as I call them, human eBays, have become the choice of the majority. Right? People, and I call them human eBays because I think dating apps are absolutely ridiculous. I cannot believe the vast majority of my friends use dating apps, and I can never believe it. I can't believe that people lower themselves to use these things, because the thought of using a dating app makes me feel sick. It's like if I want to sell something on eBay, I take photos of it, right, from different angles, and then I add like a description, right? That's what you do on dating apps. It's a human eBay. You take photographs of yourself, and then you add a biography for yourself. You're trying to sell yourself to people. That's what you're doing. It's a human meat market. It's a human eBay. And I'm sorry, but I just find that disgusting. I can't sell myself to someone romantically. I can't summarize my being in a paragraph or in a handful of photos or through text conversations. No, I am a human being. I'm not a product to be bought or followed. It just disgusts me. But people do that. People lower themselves to that. To catastrophically bad results. Some stats for you. Tinder users had lower self-esteem and body dissatisfaction than non-users. Dating app users had higher levels of social anxiety and depression. 78% of online daters report being ghosted by others online, so they just disappear. And on average, less than 10% of matches result in a face-to-face meeting. This isn't good. And in fact, it seems like the majority are now starting to turn on dating apps, because if you look at the stocks of groups like Match Group, their stock has gone down considerably, at least at the moment. People are starting to turn their backs on the apps, right? People are starting to realise that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And people are craving more face-to-face interactions. But it's not just dating apps. Others, however, have just straight up fallen in love with the technology. This is a Reddit forum that I found called "My Boyfriend is AI," and this is not a parody. I know you might be laughing at this, saying, "What? This can't be serious." No, it's serious. This is a forum of over 1,500 people, probably more at the time you're watching, where people make posts talking about how they're crying because they're so pleased to find other people who have fallen in love with artificial intelligence. Like ChatGPT, for example, large language models, and have made it their boyfriend. Mostly women, which is interesting because you would think the opposite, but no. It's mostly women who fall in love with text. Men fall in love with imagery. It's women who fall in love with text. And large language models right now are very good with text, and so it makes sense that it's called "My Boyfriend is AI" rather than "My Girlfriend is AI." It's completely logical. This is a screenshot, a photo that someone showed me, which seems to have been taken on public transport. Again, the virtual panopticon is, you can't escape it. And it's someone, I'm not going to read it, but you can zoom in, and it's someone having a romantic conversation with ChatGPT, talking about, how much they love them. And it's a partner. They're simulating having a partner. And many of you may laugh at this, but this makes me feel incredibly sad. It really does. It makes me feel incredibly upset on a level I didn't even think was possible. Because it just goes to show how lonely people are, how people feel the community frameworks, the tribal frameworks that got people their other halves no longer exist. And we've been thrown to the wolves, especially young people, 18 to 30-year-olds, to this technological hell. And you've got amazing people who can't find partners, both men and women, who would make great wives, great husbands, great mothers, great fathers, and they become deranged, obsessed with technology, bitter through these inhumane, profit-driven dating apps, and they become husks of who they used to be. The men lack confidence because they don't get the matches that they sought. The women view men as lesser because they get too many, they get too much choices, and the men who they tend to go with tend to be less than stellar. It's just such a sad situation all around. And it's clear that such faceless means of matchmaking, while convenient, aren't working, and that we must replace them with recreated faceful means of matchmaking. Right, that means, in my opinion, banning all profit-driven dating apps, and that's pretty much all of them. It doesn't make sense to me that you have dating apps that charge people on a monthly or even weekly, I've heard even daily basis, money using algorithms. Like, dating apps make their money not by people finding their partners, but by people being single. So their entire business model revolves around people being single. Why are we trusting these people to find us partners? Like, I'm not saying that I'm not necessarily making a hostile claim to these dating apps. I'm sure that they are intended to find people matches, but isn't it weird if you think about it from a more capitalistic perspective? Like, you know what I mean? Like, really? Like, this is who we're trusting? And I believe that you could create a nationalised physical ministry of matchmaking. People will laugh at me for saying this because they'll say that it's like a state-mandated husband or a state-mandated wife. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying force people into relationships. I'm saying that there should be a ministry of matchmaking until we regain a more religious, constructive framework, a faithful society, where men and women can opt in and be introduced to people based on their values, based on their personalities. Maybe even incorporate, people will nag at me for saying this, but you could incorporate artificial intelligence into it if artificial intelligence was really good at reading what make the most successful matches between men and women, what make the most successful marriages. Why not? It's not like artificial intelligence is a net bad. It has its place, but it has to be used right. And an example of using AI right is a ministry of matchmaking, getting people to be introduced face to face. An example of AI being used badly is falling in love with ChatGPT, right? But there is a place for these things, and I would love a world where people meet face to face again. Men and women meet face to face again. They enjoy each other's company. That's what we need in the modern era. And so overall then, it is clear that prioritising facefulness over facelessness is currently a blind spot in the Western world that is just waiting to be changed. Hence, again, why it is a clear blue ocean foundation for the 21st century. When you talk about facefulness to people over facelessness, they think that you're just like some sort of nostalgia freak, like you're someone living in the past, like, get with the program, old man. No, because the program isn't working. The program is a negative compared to what came before it. I'm not saying turn back the clock completely necessarily, but I am saying that this is not working. That what we're doing now is not working in many ways, and it needs to change. And people will realise this as time goes by. However, with all that said, again, we must note, despite the push for facefulness, the state, which is naturally faceless, must always be the ultimate power broker to ensure unity among all localities. Yeah, you can't have a state where it's like all the different religions are off doing their own things with their own different laws and their own different courts, and men are doing this, women are doing that, and families are all treating their homes like their own kingdoms. Like, no, at the end of the day, there must be one government, one leader that has the only power to make the laws, and everyone must follow it. You don't want a sectarian society of a bunch of mini little tribes, battling it out against each other, doing their own things. No, there has to be, at the end of the day, a collective unity. But still, I do believe that you can have that kind of state and a faceful society. These things aren't contrasting. So, there we have it. Those are my 3 blue ocean foundations for the 21st century. The blind spots in the Western world that people currently are not taking seriously, aren't really noticing. Maybe they are on a subconscious level, but certainly not on a conscious level. But as time goes by, 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, and beyond the 21st century, what you will find is that people across the Western world will crave all 3 of these things more and more and more. As time goes by, you're going to notice more and more laws, more and more suggestions, more and more proclamations being made following collectivism, pragmatism, and facefulness. Which brings us on to number 5, auditing my audience. And this is going to be quite controversial from me. Do in all my time on YouTube, there's one common thing that I've never done. A common thing that most YouTubers do, and I don't do it. Can you guess what that is? Subscribe! Right, I have never, ever on YouTube asked people to subscribe. I don't do it. You can go back, look at anything I've ever made. I never ask people to do it. And you know why? It's because I view being asked to subscribe to someone as an insult. If I think someone is worthy to subscribe to, I'll do it. I don't need to be reminded to do it. If you need to remind your viewers to subscribe, you're probably not worth subscribing to, right? If you're that forgettable that the viewer goes, oh, they can't even remember to press the button, they don't really care that much about you anyway. No, I only want to be subscribed by people who actually think that I'm subscribe worthy without being told, like someone with dementia, that they should do it. And so I never do it. I never tell people to subscribe, and I never will. But you know what I will do? In typical me fashion, I might not tell people to subscribe, but I will tell people to unsubscribe. Let me give you an apt metaphor. When I was a young lad, I used to go to a store called Game, which is a British store where you would buy games. And my favourite platform was the PC. And back in the 2000s, you could buy physical games for the PC. Now it's all digital, but you could buy physical games. And on the back of the box, at the bottom usually, there would be this little section called minimum requirements. And it would say something like, oh, in order to run this game, you need an Intel Pentium processor with 500 megahertz, a gigabyte of RAM, and at least Windows 2000. And if your computer didn't meet those minimum requirements, you couldn't play the game, right? And I believe that these blue ocean foundations that I've spoken about today are my minimum requirements for you, right? You can't play my game, right? You can't understand me. You can't really, we're not speaking the same language if you don't accept, not just understand, but accept those free blue ocean foundations. It's the minimum requirements. Because these blue ocean foundations underpin the logic of all my creations, as I said, alluded to at the start. For example, if we take a look at just the last 3 lectures before the one that I made here, my lecture on not using the internet for 6 months, that was a plea for facefulness over facelessness. People didn't realise it at the time, but that's what it was. My talking about how America accidentally conquered Britain, that's a plea for collectivism over individualism, a plea for the British people to come together as a collective and put aside the individualism that we've come accustomed to create a better state. Again, people didn't realise it at the time, but that's what it is. And again, the lecture I had last, why I hate caveman conservatives, was a plea for pragmatism over emotion. Stop believing in the flawed foundations forged from emotion. Think logically, use critical thinking skills, think pragmatically, right? And the thing is, if we are synced on the blue ocean foundations, when you watch anything I make, we speak the same language, right? You know where I'm coming from. It's like a radio that's tuned, right? If you tune your radio right, you hear the music. But if your radio's tuned wrong, all you hear is the static. You can't hear anything. You just want to turn it off, right? If when you listen to me talking about the blue ocean foundations, there's a part of your brain that lights up and goes, I thought the same thing. Maybe on a subconscious level or even a conscious level. If there's a part of you that goes, yes, that's what I've been thinking. We're speaking the same language. We're synced. Our radios are tuned. You're hearing my music and I'm hearing you, right? We get each other. But if we're unsynced, then misunderstandings are inevitable. You can see this a lot in my comment sections, right? People who don't share the blue ocean foundations, they will view, like for example, if I talk about collectivism, they'll say, you're a communist. How dare you, you're a communist. You work for the Chinese or something like that, you know what I mean? If you call for pragmatism over emotion, they'll call you an elitist. If you say that a populist leader is a narcissistic psychopath, they'll say, you're an elitist, you're a neoliberal, you want open borders. No. If you call for facefulness over facelessness, you complain about the internet and its intricacies, people will claim that you're a nostalgia freak. They'll say, oh, you're into nostalgia, you want to turn back the clock, get with the times, right? Again, it's because these people, they don't share the foundations. And because they don't share the foundations, they're not speaking the same language. They don't understand the logic behind why the proposals that I'm making in this case are being proposed. Because they don't share the same foundation. They're not tuned into the same frequency as those of us who do. And you might say, well, hang on a minute, Alex, that's not very fair. I mean, isn't it your job in a way to try to convince me to believe in the blue ocean foundations? But no. I consider it my role in a way whenever I make a lecture to convince you of something, to believe in something. It is not my role to convince you of the foundations, because the foundations are the minimum requirements. It's the bare bones basics. There's no words, there's no emotional appeals, there's no statistics that I could show someone who doesn't believe in the foundations to believe in the foundations. Because I believe that whether or not someone believes in the blue ocean foundations, I believe it typically depends on their upbringing. It's their upbringing that forges how the frequency that people are tuned into. So, for example, if we take collectivism versus individualism, someone who's had a chaotic upbringing, you were surrounded by crime, gangs, drugs, maybe your parents were alcoholics, you didn't go to the best schools, whatever. I think that you're going to have a bias to collectivism because you've grown up in a world where individualism ruined your upbringing, right? You've grown up in a world where people just do what they want. And it's not very nice, is it? It's not very pretty. You crave order, you crave you crave a collective, a civilization, because you've been traumatized by your upbringing. That's very common. Whereas someone who's had a more orderly upbringing, grew up in a gated community, middle class, upper class, police everywhere, clean streets, you don't really have, crime is just something that you hear about in the news. It doesn't really affect you. I think you're going to have a bias to individualism because you take your collectivism that you benefit from on a daily basis for granted, right? You just take it as something that is a given. You don't realise that, you actually are a massive beneficiary of a society that you don't even realise that you're a part of necessarily. And you notice this, by the way, in the people who hate you, who despise the police, the ACAB people, the people who always poo-poo the police. They're always middle class. They're always upper class. It's never the working classes who despise the police. The working classes tend to want more police because they're sick of all the crime in their neighbourhoods. Meanwhile, when middle class people, if you're a working class person and a middle class person comes into your neighbourhood, it's like you're playing Super Mario Sunshine. They just graffiti everywhere. They have no respect. They don't, because they view their family, which is usually a nice family, their neighbourhood, they view it as boring. They want action. They want to express themselves as an individual. They don't realise the alternative. I can't undo that. There's no words that I could do to undo that. You either have it or you don't. To be clear, there are some exceptions. Some people with chaotic upbringings can be individualists because they're just low intelligence. Some people with orderly upbringings can be collectivists because they're very high intelligence. They have perception. They actually can sympathise with others. But it's very rare in both cases. Again, to take pragmatism versus emotion, if you had a knowledgeable upbringing, you grew up in a house where you were introduced to other religions, talked to people from other countries, other ways of life. You weren't just indoctrinated to believe one religion, one political persuasion. You were introduced to many ways of being. Well, of course, you're going to have a bias to pragmatism because you were taught critical thinking skills. Whereas if you had an ignorant upbringing, you were told one religion, that's it. You were not educated about any other religion. One political persuasion, that's it. This is how we live. End of story. And you were punished for deviation. You were almost punished for curiosity. Then you're going to have a bias to emotion, right? You're going to be indoctrinated to believe that there's one way to do things, and conveniently enough, the one right way to do things is the way that I was raised. Oh, how convenient. Again, no words can undo that. And again, there are exceptions, but it's typically the rule. And again, faithfulness versus facelessness. If you grew up you had a lonely upbringing, your parents, maybe you didn't have a father, or your parents were both working all the time, you didn't have brothers and sisters, you were a small family, often on your own. Of course you're going to have a bias to faithfulness because you're a human being. You crave tribe, you crave family, you wish that you had more human interaction. But if you had a familial upbringing, maybe you had many brothers and sisters, your parents were around, you had a lot of cousins, that everyone's always around, your house is always filled with people, maybe you're going to think, gosh, I wish I had some me time, some alone time. I'm sick of all these faces. Give me some time on my own, right? Of course you're going to have a bias in that way. Again, there are exceptions. But typically that's the rule. And again, there's no words that I can say that will overrule these upbringings. You're either tuned or you're not tuned. But here's the thing. What do you notice about these two contrasting groups of upbringings? All those that are in favour of the blue ocean foundations, the chaotic, the knowledgeable, the lonely, and all those who are red ocean thinkers. They oppose the blue ocean foundations. The orderly, the ignorant, the familial. Here's the interesting thing. All those upbringings that favour the blue ocean foundations, they're more common in the 21st century. All those who oppose them are more common in the 20th century. Right? Think about it. People, the boomers, take the boomer generation, for example. And I say that because they're the elderly generation. Do you think they had a more orderly upbringing than the Zoomers of today? No. Most boomers had fathers. Most Zoomers, way less fathers. Right? Much more crime in Zoomers' upbringings. The boomers grew up in a much more orderly society. Right? Do you think the boomers had a more ignorant upbringing over the Zoomers? Of course they did. The boomers didn't have the internet. Boomers weren't introduced to people of different religions and could talk to people from different countries. No, they were typically stuck in their own culture, in their own religion. It's the Zoomers who have friends all across the world, talking to people from all across the world, right? Even if they may have a worse education, they are more knowledgeable. And still, do you think boomers had a more familial upbringing? Of course they did, because they had more fathers. Family life was much better. They had a much more faithful upbringing. Right? You had friends that played out in person, went to church. Zoomers, they're all way more lonely. Hell, they're given an iPad when they're really young and said, right, bye. Of course they're much more lonely. But that's the thing, right? Well, that's really interesting when you take that into consideration. I have a concept called the 20th century and the 21st century men. And the idea is, let's say the year is 2025. If you have someone who was born in 1960, well, they spent 40 years in the 20th century and 25 years in the 21st century. That means, in my opinion, that they are a 20th century man because they've been alive longer in the 20th century than they are in the 21st century. Meanwhile, if you have someone who's born in 1990, well, they only spent 10 years in the 20th century, but 25 years in the 21st century. So I call them a 21st century man. Now, this is very important because I think 21st century men are much more likely to be prone to the blue ocean foundations, right? Why? Because they've lived in the 21st century more than they did in the 20th century, right? And so they are much more in tune, in sync. Their radio is going to be much more likely to be tuned with the blind spots of the 21st century than a 20th century man who's used to the 20th century, the Cold War, post-World War era. He's still going to be thinking in red ocean terms. He's still going to be thinking in conservative, progressive, communist, neoliberal, libertarian terms. They don't think about the blue ocean foundations. They still think that the world is as it was back then. So the point is that as most 21st century men will have a bias to the blue ocean's foundations, it is the inevitable future that they will become status quo ideas, thus turning them into a new red ocean. Do you remember this term that I use a lot, the inevitable future? This is partially what it means. It is inevitable that the blue ocean foundations become red ocean. It becomes a new ideology. It becomes a new way to live, in a way, a new way to work, a new way to be human, in a way, without sounding too dramatic. It's a new way to do things that is inevitable to be noticed because of the blind spots. But it's more than that. Let's say that the year is 2045. Go forward 20 years. Well, even then, the guy born in 1960, he's now spent more years in the 21st century than the 20th. He's a 21st century man now as well. Not as much of a 21st century man as the guy born in 1990 who's now got 45 to 10. He's a real 21st century man, right? He is going to be really clued into the blue ocean foundations. But even then, even the guy born in 1960 will eventually become a 21st century man and will likely be more in tune with the blue ocean foundations. Again, he was brought up in the 20th century, so maybe not as much as the 21st century man. But he'll still believe it, right? He'll still understand it. Because while upbringing is the most formative time for determining belief in the foundations, even that can be painfully counterbalanced in the long run through time. So, some guy born in 1960 in 2045 with all the problems that we will have in the 21st century is not going to still be parroting the beliefs that he believed when he was 20, when it was 1980. He's not going to be doing that anymore because times have changed. The problems will have changed. It's the 21st century now, and even he will likely adapt somewhat to the times. The overall point of this is that I view the blue ocean foundations as an invite to the 21st century. You live in the 21st century. You may have only known the 20th century if you were born in like 2000 or something, but you don't really live in it, right? You're there, you're here physically, but you're not there mentally. Not most of you anyway. Most of you are still parroting communism, socialism, progressivism, libertarianism, neoliberalism. Do you not understand that these are 20th century ideologies or earlier? These ideologies are not prepared for the 21st century. It requires addressing our blind spots today, doing something new, thinking new ideas, a new way to do things. What I'm trying to do with these Blue Ocean Foundations is to give you an invite to the 21st century, to tell you, even if you don't see that this is the direction that the world is moving in today, because it's not clear today, as time goes by, you will see that I'm not just talking nonsense. The world will move towards collectivism, pragmatism, and faithfulness because these are our blind spots. And they are genuine problems that need to be addressed. But you can only accept the invite to the 21st century if you reject the 20th century status quo. I'm not saying that all of these ideologies and everything about them is poo-poo. I'm saying we need to take the best parts of these ideologies and address them to create something new, to address the blind spots of today. Just aligning yourself with these outdated red ocean ideologies is not going to do you any good. Communism doesn't work today. Progressivism doesn't work today, nor do all the other ideologies. You have to take parts of them and put them in a blender and create something new. Collectivism really is a communist sort of idea, really. Pragmatism is a neoliberal sort of idea, really. Faithfulness is a conservative sort of idea, and a libertarian one in a way. I'm not saying reject everything about the 20th century red ocean ideologies. I'm saying take the best parts, blend them together, and focus on the Blue Ocean Foundations. And if you do that, if you're capable of doing that, the things that I talk about will make much more sense. But not only that, rather than feeling depressed about the future, feeling pessimistic about the future, wishing that you were in the past, the golden eras of these ideologies, let's say, you will be more optimistic about the future. You will be excited about the future because you're a 21st century man, a 21st century woman. The future is bright. We have problems today, but these problems can be fixed. And guess what? You, as an individual, can play your little part, or a big part, in solving them. This is our century. I say this particularly to the young people. This is our century. This is our time. Don't spoil this century by using these old, outdated ideas, many of which didn't even work at the time that they were conceived. Think different. Think new. Think blue ocean. Break your ideological presuppositions and think outside the box. Be brave. I understand, by the way, that it's very nice to think in red ocean 20th century status quo ideas because they're very well established and there's a lot of belonging and there's a lot of online tribes and you can feel smart, and it's lonely in a blue ocean. It's lonely to think outside the box. But the future is not these. The future is the Blue Ocean Foundations. And by embracing these foundations sooner rather than later, I promise you, you will be ahead of the curve for the 21st century. Some would say that's arrogant. Some would say that's naive. Some would say, what are you, Quasimodo? What are you, Nostradamus? You can't predict the future. All the trends point in that direction. It makes sense, and a part of you must know that. And that's all I'm asking. I'm just asking, embrace the Blue Ocean Foundations. Think differently. Think outside the box. And this century could be so much better than it otherwise would be. We could progress so much quicker than we otherwise would. And I want to end on a quote by a guy called George Bernard Shaw, a writer. And he said it in Man and Superman. He said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." And yes, that's what I'm looking for. I am an unreasonable man. And I'm looking for the other unreasonable men and women, I'm looking for the round pegs in the square holes, the black sheep. But I'm not just looking for the normal black sheep, because most black sheep, they try to paint themselves white because They want to fit in. I'm looking for the black sheep who want to paint everyone else black. All right? That's the kind of people I'm looking for. The unreasonable people who look at the early 21st century that we are now a quarter way through and say, this is unacceptable. We have blind spots. These blind spots need to be addressed. And in order to do that, I'm going to go against the red ocean. I'm going to go in a blue ocean, a much more unpopular way of living. And I'm going to say what needs to be said because it's the right thing to do, not because it makes me feel good. The unreasonable man, the unreasonable woman, which all progress depends on. That's what I want you to be. And so that is the lecture. And we've discovered a lot, we've gone through a lot of things today. We've gone through red versus blue ocean thought, the 5 major political groups, value hierarchies, imperial arrogance and freedom, the ripple effect, Cog Theory, split empathy in progressives, high disgust in conservatives, the NHS as a sacred cow, the consequences of a faceless world, and an invite. You received an invite to the 21st century. And so I hope that all these things that we've spoken about, I hope that you don't just forget about them. You don't just move on and get distracted by something else. I hope that you really study these and take them in and understand that a lot of the things that I talk about, a lot of the lectures I give, the productions I make may seem weird, may seem strange, but maybe now you understand why. I'm not trying to talk and say the things that everyone else is doing. I'm trying to do something different. But not just different for the sake of being different, being a hipster. Talking about the things that need to be spoken about because it's clearly the blind spots. And I want you to do the same. But it's up to you, ultimately. And so, that is the lecture. And I would love for you to comment below. What are your thoughts on red versus blue ocean thinking, my 3 blue ocean foundations and the inevitable future and everything else we've spoken about? I'd love to know. To prove that you have watched this from start to finish, please include the word dolphin in your comment, preferably subtly. And then I will know that you are one of the people who watched from start to finish. And whether your comment's positive or negative, well received or poorly received, I'll respect it. And thank you very much to the Wall of Famers. Even though we are getting rid of the Wall of Fame, no new additions are being put on. I still thank you nevertheless while it's still there. All right, that's all. So I'll leave that with you. I'm curious on your thoughts, and I'll see you next time.